Chapter 22 of An Imperial Marriage by Arthur W. Marchmont. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Crln. Chapter 22. In Search of the Baron. Anyone who has ever lived in the capital of the German Empire, or indeed in any German town of size, knows the absolute futility of arguing with the police. Definite regulations are laid down for them, as the sand of the sea in number and an auctioneer's catalogue in precision of detail, and unless you are a person of infinite leisure and unruffled temper, you will do what they tell you and do it without remonstrance. When they insisted upon detaining me upon suspicion of having fired the shot which had attracted their notice, I could not restrain a heated protest or two, but I soon ceased to remonstrate. I chafed and fretted at the detention, all the more so because while one of them took charge of me, his companion made a long search for my assailant. He must have been an extremely conscientious fellow, for he showed more than German thoroughness in the search. They are very rarely quick in their methods, but they claim to be sure, and when he returned after nearly an hour, he had quite convinced himself that the man was not hidden anywhere near us. "You must have fired the shot," he said, with an air of satisfied conviction, "or I should have found the man. There was no one else about." He then ran his hands down outside my coat, felt my revolver and drew it out. "Ah, I knew it!" he exclaimed triumphantly. "Do let us go to the station," I said impatiently. "You'll have enough of that before this is settled. Who are you and where do you live?" I said I would explain everything at the police quarters, and to my relief we set off for them then. As a matter of fact, I was not a little bothered how to reply to the questions. If I gave my address, I knew it was quite in accordance with the regulation methods for someone to be sent to search my house, and apart altogether from the alarm which such a proceeding would cause Althea following upon the news of my arrest, there was the awkward fact of the Baron's presence there. Again, the ordinary process of interrogation would be directed to extracting from me a detailed account of my movements during the hours prior to the act with which I was to be charged. Police inquiries under such circumstances are inspired with as much minuteness as the average Teutonic biblical criticism. The inquisitor at such times always presses his questions under the belief that at the bottom of the charge there is some heinous crime which he will be able to unearth if only he is clever enough. The moment I was inside the building, therefore, I made haste to get out my version of the affair and ended with a request for a communication to be made at once to Dormund or Feldermann. The officer in charge listened with a frown of impatience and then turned to the men who had taken me in charge. He was a surly individual, and when my revolver was produced, he gathered it in with a sort of cluck, such as a broody hen might give on discovering a titbit for her chicks. "You will see that it is loaded in every barrel," I said. He did not even take the trouble to look. The fact that a shot had been fired and that I had been found running away with the possession of a weapon was obviously proof enough for him. "Well, your name and address?" he grunted as he took up his pen very deliberately. "Paul Bastable." "And where do you live? Answer." I replied that I had been a newspaper correspondent and gave him the name of the paper, adding that both Dormund and Feldermann were my friends. "Where do you live?" he repeated. "They know me perfectly well and I desire to communicate with them." "Address refused," he murmured as to himself, and wrote that down. It was the preface to just such a list of questions as I had anticipated. What I was doing in the streets at that time of night, where I had been, where I was going, why I carried a revolver, why I had fired the shot, what I had done all the evening, and so on. I returned much the same answer to all the questions, that I wished to be allowed to communicate with either Dormund or Feldermann, and we reached a deadlock, and he was ordering me to the cells when it occurred to me to play the British subject card. "Wait a moment, please," You have ignored my statement and are going to charge me with a serious offence. I am a British subject and demand to be allowed to communicate with the British consul." I knew he dared not refuse, and was pleased to see his shaggy brows knit more closely than ever as he thought it over. "How do I know that?" he asked after a pause. "Both Herr Dormund and Herr Feldermann know it." I was resolved to rub their names into him at every available chance. "Let me assure you that I have told you the absolute truth in regard to that shot. The mistake which your men made was quite intelligible under the circumstances, but it was a mistake. The shot was fired by a man whom I think I could identify. It was fired at me, and I was pursuing him when I was arrested." His face might have been a barber's dummy for all the effect this appeared to produce. A long pause followed while he thought over the position, and then he told the others to take me off to the cells. "You will enter the fact that I have demanded to see my consul, please," I said as I was led away, but like the rest, this elicited no notice. I was left to cool my heels there for about an hour. I did not care 2 straws about the charge which had been preferred against me, but the delay fretted me almost into a fever, and had I been left much longer, I believe I should have even ventured to make some attempt to escape. But to my intense relief, when the cell door was opened, Dormund was there. He favoured me with one of his driest smiles as he held out his hands. "You have a rare capacity of getting into trouble, Herr Bastable. Surely you know that revolver practice in the streets of Berlin is illegal." "You have some really sharp fellows under you," I retorted with a grin. "Last time they accused me of having murdered myself, and now they think I tried to do it again." He led me off to a room where we were alone. "Now tell me all about it." I told him succinctly what had occurred. He accepted my story at once, and together we smiled at the mistake of the others. "But you had no right to have this thing with you at all," he said, referring to the pistol. "You know the law. We shall have to keep it, and I'm afraid you must be prepared to answer for its possession. Anyhow, you can see that it hasn't been fired since it was cleaned. Get that quite clear, and I don't mind admitting that I often carry such a thing for my own protection." "Do you still wish to communicate with your consul, or to make any fuss about the mistake these men made?" "I want to get home and to bed. All the rest can hang." "We can manage that, but you'll hear about the revolver from us in a day or 2. Here are the rest of your things." And soon afterwards we left the place together. "Have you taken the advice I gave you yet?" he asked as we walked toward my house. "What was that?" "You were at the station tonight, you said. Have your friends gone?" "No," I replied after a pause, "but I can assure you that all that bother is over and done with. I've been very anxious, but I've won all along the line." "I'm very glad to hear it. How?" "You'll hear all about it tomorrow or the next day at the latest." "Well, we're schooled to patience, you know. I hope you're right, and I'm heartily glad you were not detained tonight. It might not have been so easy to get you out tomorrow if a singular rumour running around our place has any foundation about that old Jew's murder. Fortunately, I don't know anything officially, or I couldn't tell you, but I should advise you to be careful. Good night." And without waiting for any reply, he turned away and left me. I attached no importance to his words at the time. It was not probable that anything could have leaked out yet about von Felsen, or the fact that I had got a confession from him, and having that, I cared not a jot for anything else. My one anxiety was to get home and assure myself that Althea's father was still in the house. Althea met me as I entered, and her looks showed me in a second that something was wrong. "Thank heaven you have come, Paul. I have been tortured with the fear that something must have happened to you." "Your father?" I asked. She threw up her hands. "You have guessed it, then?" "Tell me. I have been haunted by the fear that he had heard us speaking about the house being clear of the police." "He has gone, Paul. What do you think can have happened?" At the sight of her agitation, I blamed myself for having let her see by my eager question how grave a view I took of the matter. "I was half afraid of something of this sort," I replied in a much lighter tone as we went into the drawing-room. "But no doubt I can put it all right. Bessie told me at the station that he had been downstairs, and that noise you and I heard when we were talking about the police was probably when he heard what we said. It is unfortunate, of course, but it will be all right." "You were only saying that to ease my mind, Paul." "No, on my word. I'm quite sure of being able to secure his pardon, and no trouble can come of this unless he meets with it from any other source. No police trouble, I mean. As for the rest, I believe I know where to look for him, and of course I must be off at once. But tell me first all what led up to his going." She described his conduct during the day. He had been possessed by the thought that there had been some treachery to the cause. Our story of the failure of this scheme had intensely excited him, and in this respect he suspected me of treachery. He had been fretting to get away to consult with others, and had only been kept in the house through fear of the police surrounding it. "I went straight up to my room the moment you left with Bessie," she concluded, "and not finding him there, went to his room. He was not there either. I called to him, but he did not reply, and thinking he might have been taken ill again, I made a thorough search of the house. He must have hidden somewhere and slipped out without my knowledge." While she was telling me this, the thought of the bomb I had given to him flashed across my thoughts, and only with the greatest difficulty could I repress the consternation it caused. Had he taken it with him? Was he mad enough to make the attempt to wreck the cruiser alone? If so, and he were found with that in his possession, or if he made any such mad attempt, the discovery of my part in the affair was all but certain. "I'll go and have a look at his room, Althea," I said quietly when she had told me all she knew, and we went upstairs together. "Thank the Lord he has left his bag here," I cried with a sigh of satisfaction as I saw it. I had never felt such a flush of infinite relief in my life before. But it was only for a moment, until I had forced the bag open. The bomb was gone. Althea saw then how the discovery affected me, the sudden rush from fear to relief and back to fear. "Paul!" Her face was white and strained. I shook myself together and forced a smile. Thank goodness he can do no harm with it at any rate. And he might have taken this too. He had left the revolver behind, and I slipped it into my pocket. He cannot get into any very serious trouble before I find him. I'll go at once. I went first to my own room to get some cartridges for the revolver in place of the blank ones with which I had before loaded it, and as we were going downstairs, Althea asked me what had kept me so long away. I was arrested, but had no difficulty in explaining matters. I did not say anything about the attempt on my life, not wishing to alarm her. "I was sure there was trouble," she cried in distress. "I have brought so much to you already." "Tomorrow we shall just smile at it all. I am absolutely confident, Althea." "I cannot smile yet, Paul, nor be confident either. I could almost wish—" I gathered her in my arms. "You must never harbor that thought again, dearest. Never if you love me. You would at least be safe, and the thought of your danger chills me with dread every minute you are away. But the mere fact that I have been in the hands of the police within the last hour, and am here now at your side, may tell you that there is no such danger as you fear. You do but frighten yourself with shadows. If there had been any real trouble such as you fear, they would have detained me." "I cannot help it, Paul. If it were only myself, I should not care," she said with a heavy sigh. "Keep this in your thoughts, then. Bessie has taken with her something which could cut the knot of our difficulties were it 20 times worse than it is. But now, what of yourself? Will you stay here alone or go to Chalice?" "Stay here. My father may return. I shall wait up all night for him." "I shall bring him back in an hour or so. You will see," I said cheerfully. I pray with all my heart you will, but where are you going? I think I know where to find him, but I must not stay to tell you any more. Keep a stout heart for that hour or so, and all will be well. I put all the cheering confidence I could into my tone and manner, but it was of little avail. I wish I could go with you, she cried wistfully. If you do not return soon, I shall be fit to do something desperate. I cannot tell you how this suspense tortures me. It was all I could do to prevent myself from coming after you just now. You cannot do anything but wait, dearest. Wait and trust. It will all come right. But although I had spoken so confidently to Althea, I was very far from feeling so, and as I hurried through the deserted streets, I wished the Baron had been at Jerusalem, and all his mad-brained schemes and cause and associates with him, before he had come to plunge us all into this unsavory mess. There was, of course, only one place in the whole city where I could go in search of him, the wharf of W. Meashan, and it was no more than a bare possibility that he or anyone else would be there at that time of night. Moreover, if I did succeed in finding him there, it was anything but clear how I could get him away. Already he entertained the gravest suspicions of me, and the moment he spoke to any of his infernal associates, all the fairy tales I had told him would be exposed. He would show the bomb which I had given to him, and it needed no gift of prophecy to understand the feeling which would be aroused against me. Every man in the crowd would be itching to slit my throat or put a bullet into me. There was just one chance in a million in my favor, that he had set out to blow up the warship by himself. But even that would not help me, as I should most certainly be unable to trace his movements. If it had not been for the sham bomb which I had given him, with its compromising history connecting me closely and certainly with it, I should have given up the quest altogether and left him to find his way back to the house. But I dared not leave that broad trail without at least a desperate effort to efface it. If it were discovered and my purchase of it proved, it would taint the whole story I had to tell of my possession of the paper I had secured from von Felsen. It would all be set down to my connection with these infernal Poles. In a word, I was just at the end of my wits, and when I turned into the lane leading down to the wharf, I did not know whether to hope that I should find it empty or not. I went very warily as I neared the place, pausing many a time to look about me. If anyone was in the building, it was almost a certainty that spies would be somewhere in hiding, to give warning to those within of the approach of any unwelcome strangers. I scanned every possible hiding spot, therefore, and satisfied myself that no one was about, and so far as I could judge, the building itself was empty. It was shut up and in total darkness. I pressed my ear against the door and listened intently for any sound within. It was as still as the grave. I think I was relieved to find it so. I was turning away to think what I could do next, when I heard a faint sound of cautious footsteps in the lane above. Whoever might be coming, I had no mind to be caught in that equivocal position, so I crept away stealthily, keeping close in the shadows, and hid myself behind a heap of rubbish which stood against the adjoining warehouse, as two men came cautiously down the narrow street. I was soon satisfied that the newcomers were not the regular police patrol, but they might be detectives. I should be in a pretty mess if they were, and I held my breath as they came near, watching them the while with straining eyes and quickened pulse, and then I saw that they themselves were being shadowed. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of An Imperial Marriage by Arthur W. Marchmont. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Crln. Chapter 23. In the grip of an enemy. The appearance of the third man was as disconcerting as it was mystifying. That he was sleuthing the other two was clear from the stealthy manner of his approach and the care he displayed in taking advantage of every scrap of shelter. He was an adept at the work. More than once the men looked around to make sure they were not followed, and each time, as if by instinct, the other had gone to cover. As they reached the warehouse, the couple became even more cautious, and the spy did not venture to show as much as the tip of his nose. With a last look around, they opened the door quickly and disappeared into the building. I dared not show myself, of course, until I knew what the spy would do, and I felt extremely uncomfortable as I waited. It was some minutes before he ventured any nearer, and then he came down the last lane with cat-like stealth and absolutely noiseless tread, and at first did what I had done, listened intently for any sounds within the warehouse. Presently he stepped back a pace and scrutinized the front, and then turned his attention to the adjoining building. While doing this, he came right up to the rubbish heap behind which I lay, and a few seconds later began to glance about him as if for a place in which to hide. The heap appeared to suggest itself to him in the same light as it had to me, and I saw that discovery was inevitable. I scrambled to my feet, therefore, not willing to be taken at a disadvantage, and without a sound he turned on the instant and bolted up the lane. I was completely mystified by this sudden flight. He was a spy, of course, but whether he had been set on by the police or was shadowing some suspected members of the band, I had no means of even guessing. Nor had I the time. If he was from the police, he would soon be back with help, while if he was one of the men, he would carry the news to his friends that someone else was dangerously interested in the proceedings. It was clear that something was going on inside the place, and I had to find the means of ascertaining whether Althea's father was there. My previous visit had shown me that access to W. Mission's premises could be obtained without much trouble from the waterfront, and although I was by no means a professional housebreaker, I had no difficulty in finding a way into the unoccupied warehouse. One of the windows was unfastened, and raising this cautiously, I squeezed through. It was a large, empty room, and as dark as a chimney, but I felt all around the walls until I came to a door, and shutting that behind me, I struck a match and found the way out onto the wharf. Then I had a stroke of luck. Tied to the wharf on the opposite side from W. Mission's was a small boat with the oars in it, and perceiving the possible value of having a means of retreat by the river in case of trouble, I decided to borrow this and fasten it in readiness for use in emergency. I hauled it along to W. Mission's landing stage and made it fast. The night was very still. The silence on the river was unbroken except for the lapping of the water as it eddied past, and the occasional creak of the small boat as it gritted against the wharf. On my former visit I had noted the position of the two doors opening from the building to the wharf. One was from the warehouse portion, the other from the offices, and the latter was unfastened. I would have given a good deal to have known whether this was due to the carelessness of the obliging young clerk, or whether it had been used that night by those who were in the building. If they were expecting any fresh arrivals by water, the discovery of my boat might be very awkward. Still, I could not stay to count the risks, so I pushed the door open and entered. I remembered that there was a flight of stone steps leading to the upper part, but before going up I crept into the offices and made sure that the men I sought were not there. I found them empty and retraced my steps and crept up the stairs, carefully feeling each step with my hands as I went. At the top the way was blocked by a door. No light showed from the other side of it, however, and after listening intently, I turned the handle very slowly, pausing at each crack it gave until it yielded. It was another big barn of a room with windows looking out over the river. My eyes were now getting accustomed to the darkness, and by the aid of the very faint light from the windows, I made out a heap of empty sacks in one corner. I was crossing toward these on tiptoe when I heard the murmur of voices. Glancing in what I judged to be the direction of the sound, I saw a light through the crack of a door, and after a pause I stole over the sacks and concealed myself among them. It proved a lucky step. I had just lain down under them when the door opened and a man came out. I recognized him as the more reckless of the couple who had been at Ziegler's with the Baron on the night of the murder. The light from the door enabled me to see more of the place. The room from which he came was at the end farthest from the stairs by which I had come up, and between that and the stairs there was another door. I judged that there were 2 offices, each communicating with the big warehouse and probably with one another. This discovery was to prove of much value a little later on. "Hush!" called someone from the room at the noise he made. "To the devil with your hushing," he muttered with an oath. "Who's to hear?" And he opened the door leading to the stairway and went down. I had had ample proof of his recklessness before, and I knew that if there were any others like him in the company, my life would not be worth a pinch of snuff should they discover me. I lay as still as the sacks which covered me, therefore. Those in the room were of a much more cautious nature, however, than the fellow who had just left them, and although they spoke together, their tones were so low that I could not make out what they said. Occasionally a single word would reach me, but I listened in vain for any indication that the Baron was among them. In my eagerness to ascertain what was being said, I was about to risk crawling to the door when I heard the man returning, and soon learned then why the door leading to the wharf had been left open. "Not a sign of them," he said as he entered to the others. "I expect the plan has missed fire. If I thought he was still fooling us, I'd shoot the old fool off-hand." He left the door wide open, and I could hear distinctly. "Not so loud, Gusson," said someone hurriedly. "Your voice carries so." "I wish it would carry to that cursed Englishman and bring him here to the old lunatic's rescue." "We have no proof. It is only your guesswork." "I want no more proof than we have. Who else was likely to betray us? Tell me that. Who else would have been able to get that cursed news into the papers and have the plans about the ship changed? Wasn't he a newspaper man of some sort? Tell me that. And how else could he get the news except from that blabbering old fool in the corner there when he was at his house?" "The news came from Paris." "Paris be hanged!" he cried fiercely with an oath. "How could they know in Paris if someone here hadn't told them from Berlin? Tell me that." There was a long pause, during which one of the men struck a match and began to smoke. So Althea's father was there all the time, and this meeting had apparently been held for my punishment rather than in connection with the meditated outrage. He was suspected of having betrayed everything to me, and my trick of getting the news published had been guessed. "We shall have to give it up for tonight, Gusson," said the man who had spoken before. "They have failed to get him to come." "Why don't they come back and say so, then?" "They may have been stopped in some way, or perhaps they came while we were away." "Schmidt has been here all the time taking care of the old fool there, or are you another of the white-livered ones?" "I've been here all through, of course. You needn't talk like that to me," said a man who had not spoken before. Gusson laughed. "I shall say what I please and you can do what you like." I wished with all my heart that the man would have started a quarrel, but he appeared to be afraid and held his tongue. "I don't mean to stay here all night," said the former speaker, whom I judged by his voice to be an older man than the others. "It isn't safe." "What will you do with our other precious leader, then?" was the reply, with a very scornful reference to the unfortunate Baron. "He can be kept here. There's plenty of room in the cellars." "If you do go, we shan't want more than enough room to bury him. You can take my word for that," was the retort with a brutal laugh. "I won't have any violence here, Gusson." "Then you'd better stop and prevent it. I shall keep my word, but you know that pretty well by this time, I fancy." The man addressed shifted uneasily and his chair scraped on the floor. "You'll do what I say, Gusson," he replied with an effort to put authority into his voice. "Then you'll have to say what I say, that's all. I haven't come here tonight for fun. Do you suppose there will be no violence, as you call it, if they succeed in persuading the Englishman to come here to the rescue of the old dotard? Tell me that." "Nothing must be done here anyway." Gusson swore contemptuously. "Well, it doesn't matter. You haven't seen him and I have, and you can take it from me that he isn't the man to take what's in store for him here without putting up a fight for his life." This unexpected tribute to my fighting instincts was flattering perhaps, but I knew what lay behind it, and it came out the next instant. "I may as well tell you what I mean to do. If they get him here, I shall shoot him straight away without wasting any time in talk." "You're too reckless. You'll get us all into trouble." "Reckless?" he repeated with a curt laugh. "I'm not reckless enough to give him a chance at me." It was a novel experience to listen to the plans for one's own murder, and I found it sufficiently depressing. I knew that the fellow was quite capable of making his words good, and that when we two did meet, it would be a question of which of us was the handier with his weapon. That the others were against the violence he threatened with such sinister bluntness would not help me in the least. He would not let their reluctance stand in the way of his purpose. He had persuaded himself that I was the traitor who had balked their plans, and was fully set upon taking my life in revenge. My plight was indeed about as desperate as it could be, and what to do constituted the toughest problem I had ever to face. There were 3 courses. One was to sneak out of the place and fetch the police, taking the risk of what might happen to Althea's father when they came, or in the interval before I could get them here. Another was to wait where I was, trusting to my luck to prevent my being discovered. In this event I should have to run the risk of allowing the other men who had gone for me to return, and to hope that the milder counsels of the elder man would prevail in regard to the Baron. The third was the bolder course of facing the 3 men there and then, before the party was enlarged. I decided at once against the first. The delay might prove fatal to Althea's father, for the man Gusson was quite capable of knocking him on the head or shooting him when he found that he was to be balked of his revenge on me. The same objection applied to the second alternative, and even more strongly. He might insist upon being left in charge of the old man, and in that event I could not entertain a doubt that Althea would never see her father again alive. The third course appeared at first sight the most dangerous, but was not so in reality. There were only 3 men in the room beyond, and 2 of these were opposed to Gusson's policy of violence, and with him I need have no scruples, and should have the advantage of surprise. I was very unwilling to take life, and the reluctance was so strong that, although I felt perfectly justified in creeping up to the room and shooting him before he saw me, I could not persuade myself to do it. But I would shoot him with no more compunction than I would have shot a dog the instant he made any sign of an attempt to harm me. I decided therefore that the bolder course was also the safer, and I began to edge myself free from the sacks under which I lay concealed. In doing this I made enough noise to attract the attention of the men. "What's that?" It was Gusson's voice, and he sprang to his feet. "I heard nothing," said the other man. Gusson came out and stood listening. I could have shot him then and ended the affair, but my reluctance to kill a man in cold blood stayed my hand. "It must be the boat," he murmured, turning back for a moment into the room. "I'll go down and see. They may want my help, and we may be able to use your river scheme after all." "Don't do anything rash, Gusson. A shot out there in the night would rouse the whole city. For God's sake, man, be cautious." "Oh, to hell with your caution," he muttered as he came out again and went to the stairs. "If I don't come back, you'll know I've taken him down the river." In a second I had another scheme, and that one pleased me better. The only really dangerous man here was Gusson, and I resolved to follow him and tackle him alone. He all but closed the door of the room after him, and I slipped from my shelter and crept as noiselessly as I could after him. One of the others heard me, however, and just as I reached the head of the stairs, he came out to listen. "I'm sure I heard something. They must have come. Should we go down? I'm afraid of Gusson's rashness." "Oh, leave him to himself." This was from the man whom Gusson had called Schmidt, and who had spoken so little, and at that his companion returned to the room. I crept down the stairs, pausing now and then in the half-hope that Gusson would return, when I should have a double advantage in my attack: surprise and a greater height from which to strike. But I reached the door leading to the waterfront before I saw him. He was standing on the edge of the wharf, his figure silhouetted sharply against the sheen of the gliding river, shading his eyes as he looked anxiously upstream for some sign of those he was awaiting so impatiently. I was on the point of making my rush for him when he turned and looked straight in my direction. I thought he saw me and held my breath in expectation of his attack, but I had presence of mind enough to remain as still as a stone figure. Then he turned away, and I concluded that I had been too deep in the shadow of the doorway for his eyes to pierce the darkness. He moved off toward the end of the wharf, and then I saw him start and stare down intently at the river below. He had discovered the boat which I had fastened there, and he stooped down to examine it closely. Intent upon this, he did not hear my steps as I crossed toward him, and when he rose I was close to him and had him covered with my revolver. His surprise was so complete that he all but staggered backwards into the river. "The Englishman!" he exclaimed with a foul oath as his hand went to his pocket. "You won't move," I said in a low, tense tone. He recovered his coolness on the instant. "You daren't fire here," said he. "You'll see that if you move." "How did you get here?" "Turn around with your back to me." "What for? What do you want to do?" "Do as I tell you. Quick." For a moment he hesitated whether to try the trick of a fight for it, but with a shrug of the shoulders he obeyed. "Now get down into that boat." He paused again and again obeyed. "Throw those oars out here," I rapped out sternly. I knew he had a revolver on him and watched him like a lynx. "Well, it's a fine night for the river," he said carelessly as he picked up one of the oars and tossed it on the wharf. I went a little nearer to the edge to watch him more closely as he picked up the other, not for a second suspecting his intention. "Same place as the other?" he asked in the same indifferent tone. "Don't fool with me," I cried. But he did. Just as he seemed about to toss the oar to the side of the other, he swung it around and thrust it violently into the pit of my stomach. A fool in my unpreparedness, I staggered, my pistol dropped from my hand, and the next instant he was back on the wharf with his hand at my throat. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of An Imperial Marriage by Arthur W. Marchmont. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Crln. Chapter 24. From Peril to Peril. Gusson was a very heavy-built man, as well as much more muscular than I, and I should not have had 1 chance in 10 against him in a struggle, even had the conditions been equal. But they were anything but equal. I had allowed myself to be caught at such a disadvantage that the fight was as good as finished even before it had begun. At the mere force of his rush upon me, I went down like a throttled puppy, choking vainly for breath as his fingers played a lively tune on my windpipe. I knew that he meant to have my life, and I have never been so near death as when I lay staring helplessly up into his eyes, ablaze with the joy of victory and drunk with the lust for vengeance. My first effort was a desperate attempt to drag his hands from my throat, but although I put out all my strength and squirmed and wriggled and twisted to elude his grip, I could do nothing. His arms were twice as thick as mine and quite as hard, and to stop the twistings of my body he knelt on me, pressing his knees into my ribs and stomach until I thought the bones would crack. I made frantic struggles for breath under the grim iron ruthless grip of his steely hands, and as I felt the blood congesting in my brain and the deadening sense of suffocation growing, I abandoned all hope and had no longer power to offer resistance. But even at that instant the lock turned. I was throwing out my hands wildly in vague, convulsive movements when my left hand struck against my revolver. On the instant, hope and the love of life revived. To distract his attention, I recommenced to struggle, using my right hand only, and just as he was lifting me up to dash my head against the ground and finish the thing, I fired and shot him in the head. Death was instantaneous, I think. His grip relaxed, and he was falling forward on top of me when I had just sufficient strength left to push him to one side. I lay still for some moments, incapable of movement, while the effects of the struggle and my terrible fight for breath continued. And at length I sat up, dazzled, dizzy and bewildered, until the instinct of self-preservation roused me to effort. I scrambled to my feet and stood, staggering and shaking like a drunken man, as I looked down at the still body and wondered in a vague, dreamy way what I had better do with it. I was, in very truth, drunk with the peril through which I had passed, and with the relief of my unexpected escape from death. Then I remembered the men in the room above, and wondered if they had heard the shot fired, and what they would do in consequence. I had still the work to do which had brought me to the place. For Althea's sake I must go through with it, and the thought of her put fresh strength into me. My antagonist was lying close to the edge of the water, and this started an idea. I staggered along to the end of the landing stage, unfastened the boat, and dragged it close to where he lay. Then, having taken the precaution to exchange revolvers that he might appear to have killed himself, I bundled him into the boat and thrust it out for the stream to carry it where it would. All the time I had been wondering dimly why the men above had not come out to learn the reason of the shot, and now I began to wish they would come. I was recovering mastery of both wits and muscles, and perceived that if they would but help me by coming down, I could easily drive them into the river at the point of the revolver to swim for their lives. In this hope I waited for what seemed a long time, but either they had not heard the shot, or they were afraid to venture down. When they did not come, there was nothing for it but for me to go up again to them. Now that the one desperate man, Gusson, was dead, I feared them no longer. The other man's persistent urging of caution and the other's fear of Gusson led me to believe that they were of the order of men who can plan trouble for others to do, but don't care to take a hand in carrying it out. As they would probably conclude that any noise I made was caused by Gusson returning, there was no need for any particular caution, so I ran up the stairs and crossed to the room with a firm tread. "Was that a shot just now, Gusson?" asked the elder man. "You weren't fool enough to fire at this time of night outside." He had barely finished the question when I entered the room, bringing them both to their feet with a cry of surprise. "Who's Gusson?" I asked, "and where's the Baron von Ringheim?" "It's the Englishman." This was from the man of few words, and he clapped his hand to his pocket, so I covered him. "You can take it out and lay it on the table there," I said sternly. He fumbled at his pocket in hesitation, but a slight movement of my weapon decided him, and he laid a revolver on the table, which I pocketed. "Put your hands up, Hugh," I said to the other. He was a man of some 50 years of age and stood staring aghast at me. But he put his hands up and I ran through his pockets to make sure he was not also armed. He was not. "Now we can talk with less strain. You sent for me to come here to help the Baron. I'm here to do it." Both were still all but speechless with amazement. "What do you mean?" faltered at length the elder man. "Wasn't it you who sent for me?" He fell back into his chair and stared at me in silence, passing his hand across his brow distractedly. "You'd better begin to think a bit. If you didn't send for me, I shall come to the conclusion that you meant to harm him, and in that case we shall quarrel." Yes, I did send for you," he answered hesitatingly. "We have managed to save him from the anger of some of those who meant to harm him." "Then hand him over to me and I'll relieve you of your guard. Where is he?" He half turned toward the corner in where I saw the poor old man lying bound. "He was very violent and we had to restrain him or he would have run into danger." "You make a poor show as a liar, but never mind, release him." "We can do it safely now," he said to his companion, adding to me very nervously, "I am not lying. We have saved his life." "Quick," I said sternly. "As for your not lying, I have been concealed in the warehouse there long enough to hear what has passed." "Then you know what has become of our friend?" he asked as the other began to set the Baron free. "He has gone off in a boat." "But that noise, that pistol shot, was it a shot? It may bring the police here to us." "I should think it's very likely. You'll be able to tell them how you saved this old man's life," I replied dryly. "Not that there seems to be much life left in him," I added as the Baron was brought up to the table and the light of the lamp fell on his bloodless features. It was like the face of the dead. He was unconscious, and I laid him in full length on the table and set to work rubbing his hands and chafing his limbs to restore the circulation. While doing this, I found the bomb in his pocket and transferred it to mine. "If he is dead, you will answer for it," I said, hot with rage against them. I could detect no pulse, and my efforts to restore him appeared to have no effect. "We have not harmed him, I swear that," declared the elder man. "Well then, you'd better do your best to restore him." "He's in your hands now. I cannot remain here any longer." "Can't you?" The look with which I accompanied the words was enough, and the two of them fell to work with me on the instant. We succeeded in bringing him round at length, but he was as helpless as a newborn babe, and to get him away from the place by any means short of carrying him was impracticable. What to do perplexed me infinitely. The time was running away fast, and this threatened a double trouble. The men who had gone in search of me might return, or the police might arrive, either roused by the shot which had killed Gusson, or brought by that spy whom I had seen on my arrival. Either event would be fatal to me. To add to my exasperation, I saw how, fool-like, I had myself destroyed what would have been a feasible means of escape. If I had not sent that boat off with its ghastly burden, I could have used it now, and I cursed myself for my stupidity. To get another was impossible. I could not leave the place to go and hunt for one, neither could I send the others. I might whistle for a sight of either of them again if once he got his nose outside. And so far as I could tell, the old man would not be fit to walk for hours. That we should remain there all that time was out of the question, of course. But I had to do something, and at length decided to carry him down to the waterside, let the two men go where they would, and hunt up some means of getting the Baron away by water. "You must carry him down to the air," I said. I was compelled to make them do it, lest they should attempt some treachery. Both were only too glad of the chance to escape thus offered them, and they were in the act of picking him up when sounds from below reached us. They dropped him again and stood looking at one another and shaking with fear. It flashed on me instantly that the police had come, and in order that I might have a plausible tale to tell and appear to have been threatened by my two companions, I ordered them back into a corner of the room and drew out my revolver again. "Don't you move so much as a finger," I cried. My intention was, of course, to act as if I had rescued the Baron. But I blundered. It was not the police. 3 men came hurrying up the stairs and into the room, and in one of them I recognized the fellow who had been with Gusson at Ziegler's house on the night of the murder. He recognized me at the same instant. One of the 3, not understanding the position and addressing the elder of the 2, exclaimed as he entered, "We haven't got him, General." "But we have, there he is," cried his companion. The pause of surprise was broken by a laugh from one of the newcomers. "What the devil does all this mean?" he asked. At this point, the cowardice of the man they had called the General promised to stand me in good stead. Watching me carefully lest I should carry out my threat to shoot him, he stepped forward a pace and said, "There has been a great mistake. Gusson was wrong, and there has not been any treachery. We were just about to leave here." But this statement was received with a jeering scoff. "Where are your wits, General?" cried the man who had spoken first, and who appeared to exercise some amount of authority. "We all know that someone betrayed us, and Fritz Gusson was right. It could only be this man." He jerked his hand in my direction. "And we know where he got it from." And he emphasized this with a nod toward the old Baron, lying so still and white on the table. "Didn't he tell us so himself?" "He does not know what he says. He's out of his mind," was the reply, and for a while they wrangled. "Well, where's Gusson? He can settle this between us," said the newcomer after a while. "He has gone," and the speaker added the story about the supposed shot and subsequent disappearance of Gusson. The men listened very intently and kept shooting back angry faces of suspicion at me. They guessed what had occurred. "Where is he?" they demanded, turning to me when the General finished. I was on the horns of a dilemma. If I made any show of force, I should be giving the lie to the General's statement. "He went off down the river to look for you," I answered. "Down the river?" cried another quickly. "You hear that?" "Well, up the river, then," I said sullenly. "You shot him, that's the truth," came the retort, sharp as a pistol report. This appeared to give me the opportunity I sought of being able to take out my revolver without any apparent hostile intention. "Here's my revolver. You can see for yourself it hasn't been fired." But it was as bad a blunder as I could have made. One of them craned his neck forward as if to satisfy himself of the truth of what I had said, and then gave a cry of rage. "It's Gassen's pistol! There's his mark on it, I know it!" The rest followed his pointing finger. "Well, anyway, it's loaded in all 6 chambers, and it's the only one that's going to be drawn now." I spoke very coolly and watched the 3 newcomers closely. "What about no treachery now?" cried one, turning to the elder man. "You've brought this on yourselves by suspecting me. You'd better go before there's any trouble," I said to the 3. If I could get rid of them, the others would give little trouble enough. "You'd better go," said the general nervously. They were perplexed what to do, and stood hesitating near the door. The sight of my weapon had a very wholesome restraining effect. One of them began to back out, and it looked as if I was going to get my way and frighten them off. But just as this appeared most probable, and I was beginning to breathe more freely again, trouble came from the man Schmidt, whom I had treated with contemptuous indifference as of no account. He had been standing in the corner to which I had thrust him on the arrival of the others, and had not spoken a word. I had almost forgotten him indeed, but I was to pay for that forgetfulness now. As I stood facing the others, he was on my left hand, and he hurled something at me with great force. It struck my revolver hand, and the weapon dropped. When I recovered my surprise, I was looking down the barrels of 3 pistols pointing straight at my head. "No shooting here, Marks," cried the elder man earnestly. "It isn't safe." "Why didn't you say that when he was covering us?" was the angrily spoken reply. "He shall pay for Gassen's death." But the terror of the consequences made the man earnest, and for a second he stood right in the way of the pointed weapons. They pushed him hurriedly aside, but I had been able to use the moment. I clapped my hand to my pocket, feeling for the weapon I had annexed, but instead I felt the bomb I had taken from the old baron, and raised it high so that all should see it, just as the man was thrust to one side. "I'll send him to hell for that," declared the more daring man. "Then we'll all go there together," I cried in a ringing voice. "I can do it with this." One of them fired at once, and that I was not killed was due only to the general's terror. He threw up the fellow's arm as he fired. "For God's sake," he exclaimed, "are you all mad?" "You fool," was the reply. "The thing's only a sham." Again he was being pushed aside when another man came rushing in. "The police!" he cried, and at the same instant we heard a loud peremptory knocking at one of the street doors below. In a moment panic held every man in the room in its thrall. Dead silence fell on us. But I doubt if any of them was more utterly confounded than I, or more desperately embarrassed. To fall into the hands of the police was better than to be shot down like a dog, but it meant 100 hazards for me to be caught under such circumstances. We all stood staring at one another like a set of wax figures, the common peril knitting us together in a bond of panic. Then the knocking was repeated with even louder clamour than before. End of chapter 24.
Chapter 25 of An Imperial Marriage by Arthur W. Marchmont. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Deon Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. An awkward plight indeed. The second clamor of the police at the doors below brought me to my senses, and luckily I was the first man to throw off the apathy of alarm which their coming had caused. If any of us were to escape, it could only be by the river, and I set about making a desperate attempt to get away by that means and to take the Baron with me. As I had had to carry my life in my hands when coming into the building, and had been fully alive to the fact that my safety might depend upon my knowing how to get out of it again without even a second's hesitation, I had observed with scrupulous care the means of exit. The room in which we all were was the larger of the pair of offices, the two doors of which I had seen when hiding in the outer warehouse. The partitions were of rough matchboarding, and I noticed now that the door fastened with a spring lock. The only light we had was from a lantern standing on the table, and my first step was to knock this off the table. I used the instant of consternation which followed to spring at the fellow who had entered last and was holding the door, thrust him away, and slammed the door. The hubbub and confusion which followed were indescribable, and the air reeked with the curses and execrations of the men, who appeared to have only a very slight acquaintance with the plan of the place. They were all jammed together in a body close to the door, and struggling, swearing, and fighting one another in their frantic efforts to get out. Not one of them had a thought to spare for the helpless old man on the table, and I picked him up and ran through to the smaller room beyond. One of the five had known of this other exit, and he was at the door as I reached it. He got out before me and turned to call to the rest. Which of them it was I don't know, but I struck at him and hit him hard enough to send him sprawling along the floor of the warehouse, and before he could regain his feet, I was well on my way down the stairs to the wharf. The police, meantime, were thundering at the doors which led out upon the lane and beginning to break them in, and as I reached the bottom I heard the men above rushing after me down the stairs. It was a question of seconds now. I slammed behind me the door which led out on to the wharf, and a glance showed me where the boat lay in which the men had arrived. I darted to it, slid the Baron into the bows, and with my heart in my mouth cast the painter loose and jumped in, just as the rest of the men came streaming out on to the wharf. They gave a yell of rage as they caught sight of me, and one of them, the brute who had been so intent on taking my life, ran along the stage and jumped after me. I had not been able to push the boat off any distance, but had seized hold of one of the oars. He landed in the boat, nearly capsizing her, but before he could recover his balance, I thrust the end of the oar into his stomach and sent him overboard. The next instant I was pulling downstream for my life. The wharf and all upon it were soon lost in the gloom, and the sounds of a struggle, presumably between my late companions and the police, grew gradually fainter and fainter as I increased the distance between us. I had succeeded in escaping for the moment, but my troubles were by no means over. The men whom my flight had so enraged would tell the police all about me and the direction in which I had gone, and in a short time the river would be alive with parties searching for me. To remain in the boat for long was therefore out of the question, and yet I could not leave it safely. The trouble was, of course, what to do with my companion. But for him I would have landed at once and have made my way home. But he could not walk a step, and indeed, when I stopped rowing for a moment to examine him, I found that he was once more unconscious. I considered very carefully whether the really best course in both our interests would not be to abandon him and get my story of all that had occurred to Felderman, or even to Herr Borsen. It was all important that I should get my version of the affair to the authorities first, and I was confident that the knowledge I possessed in regard to von Felsen would enable me to secure the Baron's pardon as well as clear myself. But I could not face Althea and tell her that I had found her father, that he was desperately ill, but that I had left him drifting in an open boat on the river while I made sure of my own skin. I must find some other plan than that. By hook or crook, I must manage to get him to some sort of shelter. Where to look for one, or even how to set about the search, puzzled me consumedly. My vague idea was that I might be able to discover some cottage where a few marks would secure what was wanted, and as it was certain that nothing of the sort would be found down the stream and in the middle of the city, I pulled across the river, and hugging the banks as closely as practicable, I doubled on my tracks and rowed as hard as I could upstream. I did not get through without a couple of disquieting scares. I had been rowing for a long time and was resting to take breath when I heard the sound of oars in the distance. I could not be certain whether the sound was coming up or down the stream, so I paddled quietly into the side, shoved the nose of the boat into some reeds on the bank, and lay down. It proved to be a false alarm, however. The boat was coming downstream, and I judged it to be either some early fishermen or some peasants taking produce down to the market. But this decided me to abandon the river at once. It was now close to the dawn, and if we were seen, the news would be told to anyone in pursuit, and my thought was to destroy all traces of our course by sinking the boat. I rowed across the river again, therefore, and picked up my companion and carried him ashore. This roused him, and as I laid him down he began to babble and chatter with all the inconsequence of an imbecile. I then undressed and pushed off into the river again, drew out the bung, and wedged the oars under the thwarts. When the boat was nearly full, I plunged into the water, hung on to the stern until she sank, and then swam ashore. While dressing, I felt the bomb in my pocket and the revolver which I had taken from the men in the warehouse. The Baron had been watching me with the intent stare of lunacy, but the moment his eyes fell on the bomb, some chain of thought appeared to be linked up in his bewildered wits, and he came at me and tried to get possession of it. But I flung it far out into the river and sent the revolver after it. This appeared to enrage him, for he began to fight with me with more strength than I could have believed possible after his experiences of the long night of hardship, and kept up an incessant stream of angry invective. In the midst of it I heard the throbbing of an approaching launch, and knew at once that this time it must be the police. There was sufficient light now for anyone on the river to be able to see us where we were, especially if any sound of his voice attracted their attention. It was an awkward predicament, and a dangerous one too. I had no alternative but to use force. Some bushes were close by, so I caught him up in my arms, thrust one hand over his mouth, and dragged him to shelter, where I had to lie at full length upon him to keep him quiet until the launch had passed. I told him that the police were close upon us, but he would not or could not understand, and he writhed and wriggled to free himself the whole of the time the launch was passing, and indeed until the snort of its engines was no longer to be heard. When I released him, he got up and tried to rush away, and again I had to drag him back and use force to hold him. But his efforts had weakened him considerably, or perhaps the paroxysm of rage had passed, for he lay comparatively quiet while I tried to think what to do next. I was some miles from the city, in a district of which I knew nothing. The light was strengthening every minute. I had a madman to take charge of, and must either get him back safely and secretly to my house, or at least find some sort of shelter where he could remain under supervision. The first step was, of course, to get far enough away from the river bank not to be seen by anyone on the lookout for us. But nothing would induce him to leave the waterside. He retained in his poor crazed brain some remnants of recollection of the scheme to destroy the cruiser, and the fact that it had to be done on the river, and for this purpose the impulse to stay near the water was irresistible. I tried to reason with him, and to make him understand the danger of his being arrested, every argument and persuasion I could think of, but it was absolutely useless, and when at length I essayed to force him to come away, he set up struggling and yelling. I had to employ force again. I fastened my handkerchief over his mouth as a gag, for his cries were loud enough to be heard at some distance, and then carried him away across some fields for some few hundred yards. I began to consider again very carefully whether in both our interests it would not be best for me to abandon him and hurry back to the city alone. But I could not bring myself to desert the helpless old man. I must find some other plan than that. I must get him to some sort of shelter, and that one consideration must determine everything else. Another spell of weakness followed my last exercise of force, and when I took off the gag and released my hold of him, he remained quiet. I sat and watched him, hoping that he would sleep, and that the sleep would to some extent soothe his excitement and reduce his delirium. He did fall asleep, and for an hour or so I watched him. He started every now and then and talked a little, murmuring some fragments of sentences. I heard Althea's name and mine, and stray references to his country, but I paid little attention. The truth was, I myself was so overcome with fatigue that it was with the utmost difficulty I could keep my eyes open. When he woke, he was much calmer and spoke almost rationally. I explained the position, and he seemed to understand it. And when I said our safety depended upon our getting to some place of shelter, he agreed. But I noticed that he would not look me in the face, and kept eyeing me furtively with quick, stealthy glances, lowering his head each time I looked at him. This was a small matter, however, and as he rose steadily to go with me, I was more hopeful than I had been at any time before. But I found that I was used up. I could scarcely drag one leg after the other, and when after some time I saw a cattle shed with the door invitingly ajar, the desire for rest, the imperative need for it, indeed, took too strong a hold of me to be resisted. I found some fodder lying in one corner of the place, and on this he lay down immediately, declaring that he was worn out. In the hope that the rest, even without sleep, would serve to refresh me, I sat up and watched, while he slept as quietly and peacefully as a child. But nature would not be denied, and when I caught myself nodding drowsily, I fastened his wrist to mine with my handkerchief, and lay back with an intense sigh of relief. I was a light sleeper at all times, and was confident that the least movement of my companion would rouse me. My confidence was misplaced, however. I must have slept very soundly, for when I woke the sun was high in the heavens, streaming in through the wide open door, and a man, presumably the owner of the barn, was standing over me with a pitchfork in his hand, demanding very angrily what I meant by sleeping there. And the Baron was gone. One end of the handkerchief was still fastened to my wrist, but the other was dangling loose. "You'll come to the police, you rascal," cried the farmer. "Who are you, and what the devil do you mean by being here? Where did you come from?" He flung the questions at me as I sat up rubbing my eyes and blinking stupidly at him. I made an effort to rise, but he threatened me with the fork. "Lie still, or you'll have something else than bread in your belly for breakfast," he threatened. I saw the force of the argument and obeyed. "I am sorry you take it so ill. I have done no harm, and—" I began, but he cut me short. "No harm, you dirty rascal. It's scoundrels like you that are the pest of the country. Lazy, loafing tramps, sneaking about and stealing whatever you can lay your hands on." And he let himself go on what was evidently a sore subject with him. His fury was all out of proportion to the cause of it, even supposing I had been the tramp he deemed me. To argue with anyone in such a rage as possessed him at that moment was obviously useless, however, so I let him storm and abuse me as he pleased. While he held that fork, I knew that any retort from me might make him use it. He mistook my calmness for fear, and as he warmed to the congenial work of abusing me, he grew more threatening with his weapon, and flourished it about in such a way that I expected any moment to find it plunged into my body. I simulated dire alarm, and cringed and winced at his gestures in a way that gave him huge delight. But it also led him to give me the chance for which I was waiting, and when at last an opportunity came, I dragged the fork out of his grasp, jumped to my feet, and placed myself between him and the door. For once, at any rate, I traded on somebody else's evil reputation. The farmer ran rapidly down the scale through surprise to almost abject fright. He stood shaking in every limb, with his eyes darting from the fork to my face, as if he expected me to treat him to the same sort of breakfast as that with which he had so glibly threatened me. "I didn't mean it," he stammered. "I know you have done no harm. It'll be all right, my man. You can go. I'm glad you've changed your tone, but you've made a mistake about me. I hope you can see that." I do," he cried readily, his eyes still fixed warily on the pitchfork. I turned and tossed it away behind me, and he heaved a sigh of relief. "If I have done any harm, I'll pay you," I said, taking out some money. "How much? 5 marks? 10 marks? By the way, what time is it? My watch has stopped." And I pulled it out with a view to impress him still further. It had the due effect, and his manner changed again, but he was not quite free from suspicion. "I do not charge for such a trifle," he said, with an air of nervous apology mingled with doubt. "I am quite willing to pay you, and quite able to, and if you can give me some breakfast—not of that sort," I laughed as I pointed round to the fork, "I shall be happy to pay for that also. I lost my way in the night, and overcome with fatigue I lay down to sleep. I had a friend with me, but he must have got up and gone out while I slept. Here, you'll want this, I suppose," and I picked up the fork and handed it to him. "Shall we walk up to your house? If I had seen it in the night, we should have knocked you up." As I handed him the fork, he looked at me, and then a smile spread slowly over his broad face, as my easy manner drove home the conviction that I really was not the desperate character for whom he had mistaken me. "You can have some breakfast, and welcome, but it's nearer dinner time. It's close to midday." I wound up my watch and set it to the correct time which he gave me. "I suppose you haven't seen anything of my friend?" I asked carelessly. "No, At least no one who has said anything about having a friend anywhere about here. But we had a stranger at the house this morning asking for some food, but he's a very old man and ill. It was the Baron, right enough, and the good news excited me greatly. That's the man, I cried eagerly. He is ill. Let's push on to the house at once. And I hurried on at a rapid pace. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of An Imperial Marriage by Arthur W. Marchmont. A Charge of Murder. The farmer lumbered along at my side for a while, puffing and blowing hard, and as we climbed a hilly field we had to call a halt. "I'm not so young as you," he said, gasping and wiping his forehead. "I'm very anxious to get to my friend," I replied. He didn't seem very anxious to see you. At least he didn't say anything about any friend. But it was a hint from him which sent me down to that barn of mine to look for you. "What did he say?" I asked, seeing that there was something behind his words. "We've had a very rough character about these parts for some time past. A rascal that has been robbing right and left, and has knocked one or two of the neighbors on the head, and I was speaking of him to my wife before the old stranger, and he turned and said he had seen a man of that sort in the barn there." I laughed, but held my tongue. "You must excuse me, but is there anything funny about the old gentleman? He is a gentleman, of course. I could see that in a twinkle." The question gave a hint of the line to take. "Did you notice anything odd about him then?" "It's not for me to talk, of course, but my wife thought he was a bit strange in his head." "Poor old fellow," I replied in a tone of commiseration. "Ah, I thought as much," was the answer with a note of self-satisfaction. "My wife isn't often wrong. Are you in charge of him, so to speak?" "He is in my charge just at present, but I'm not his keeper, if that's what you mean. He's as harmless as a child, but he fancies himself a desperate conspirator. He's a noble. He told us that, but we didn't believe him. It's true, and of course his people are well able to pay handsomely for anything that is done for him." The bait was taken readily. "I shall be glad to help, of course, if I can." "If he's still at the house, you can. I want to get on to the city and send his friends out for him. If you could look after him meanwhile, you could name your own price, and I'll pay you something on account of it. I suppose he really is harmless. I mean he wouldn't be likely to give any trouble if we kept him in the house." "Oh, no chance of it, and certainly not if you or I were in the room with him, although of course I must get on to the city. I suppose 2 or 3 20-mark pieces would pay you for a lost day." "I should think it would be worth 5, he replied, with Teutonic aptitude for driving a bargain. "It's a lot of money, but we'll make it the 5 with an extra one for the wife, if she looks well after him. I always like the wife to have something." We came in sight of the house soon after that, and with intense satisfaction I saw the Baron sitting by the door, basking in the sunlight. Fearing that possibly he might take fright when he saw me and run away, or do something to scare the farmer from the bargain, I gave the latter a couple of gold pieces as an earnest, and sent him on ahead to get the Baron up into a room. There was no difficulty. He went up to the Baron, who greeted him with a condescending smile. They spoke together, and I breathed a sigh of fervent thanksgiving when the two went indoors. That load was lifted from my shoulders, and I followed to the house after an interval. Over a hearty meal I heard that the Baron had been put to bed, where he had fallen fast asleep. I did my utmost to ingratiate myself with both the farmer and his wife, and laughed as heartily as he himself did when he told her how he had treated me in the barn. And with a promise that they should be relieved of their charge as soon as possible, I sent off in the farmer's cart for the nearest station on my way back to the city to relieve Althea's anxiety and send her out to her father's assistance. The stroke of good luck in finding a shelter for him had raised my spirits, and as I paced up and down the platform of the little by-station, where I had to wait over an hour for the train, I was able to view with comparative ease of mind the complications which still beset me. My first step was obvious. As soon as I had seen Althea, I could get an interview with Herr Borsen and make a clean breast of everything, both in regard to myself and von Felsen. I was convinced in my own mind that the man who had fired that shot at me after leaving the station had been instigated by him. I had seen him at my house, had recognized him at the station, and again after he had fired at me. In the face of that, it would be quixotic to wait for further proofs before letting von Felsen feel the weight of my hand. That day should see the end of things so far as he was concerned. I would hand over to Herr Borsen not only the confession of the theft of the papers, but also that of the murder. As I recalled my interview with him, I saw how he had fooled me, and that his prompt recovery from terror, which I had attributed to his relief at hearing that his life might still be saved, was in reality due to his belief that he could compass my death in time to save himself from all trouble through the revelation of what I had forced from him. Such a snake as that deserved no mercy, and he should have none. I anticipated very little trouble in getting out of my own troubles. I had committed no crime. My association with old Ziegler and the men who had been plotting against the government was in reality innocent enough, and although it was probable that those whom I had outwitted on the previous night would tell of my presence at the wharf, and would do all they could against me, the fact that I had gone in search of the Baron would put that right. The one step which I did regret was that I had had to take the life of the man Gasson, but it had been done in self-defense. I had not intended to do more than send him adrift in the boat, while his attack on me had meant murder, and nothing short of it. But whether it would be prudent to open my lips about it was questionable, and I would await developments before deciding. Although I was in a very confident mood as I drove from the station to my house, and jubilant in my anticipation of Althea's delight at the good news I could give her about her father. But instead of having to deliver good news, I had to receive bad, the worst indeed. The servants were alone in the house and on the point of leaving it, and I found Ellen sitting disconsolately in the hall, her eyes red with weeping, dressed in her hat and jacket, ready to go. "What is the matter? Where is Fraulein von Ringham?" "She has gone, sir. There has been such trouble here. We had the police looking for you, and they searched the house from top to bottom," she wailed, her words interspersed with sobs. "Cook has packed, sir, and I can't stay, if you please." "Very well, but before you go, try and tell me something more definite." She fumbled in her pocket and brought out a telegram. "The Fraulein opened it, sir. I didn't, and she told me I must get it to you, as it was very important. It was from Bessie, and announced her safe arrival in Brussels, with everything." This was one piece of good news at any rate. "Now, Ellen," I said, turning to question her. "Of course you must go away if you wish, and I shouldn't think of stopping you. But I assure you the whole business is a mistake somewhere, and you do not run the faintest risk in staying here. Martha has not gone yet?" This was the cook. "No, sir, but she's just ready." "Well, while I change and look around, go tell her to see me before she leaves." "But the police told us both to go, sir." "I'm not at all sure that you've had the police here at all. Did the Fraulein go away with them, whoever they were?" "No, sir. Herr von Felsen was here and was with her when the men were turning the place upside down. You never saw such a mess as they've made of things." "Never mind the mess. Did he come with them?" "Just before them. He was very excited and said they were coming." "What time was that?" "About midday, sir." "And when did he leave? Did the Fraulein go with him?" "Yes, sir. That was about an hour ago." "It was just 4 o'clock. If I had not had to wait for that train, I should have been in time to take a hand in the business." "I am quite convinced from your answers that these men were not police, Ellen. But tell me, were any of them the men who were watching the house yesterday?" "Yes, sir. One of them spoke to me yesterday, and it was he who told us today that if we didn't go we should be in trouble. He behaved shameful, and wanted to put us out then and there without our boxes. But cook, she up and told him she wasn't going without hers, and then he gave us an hour to clear out in." "Well done, Martha," I exclaimed, as the cook came downstairs. I explained to her that the men had not been the police, and endeavoured to allay the fears of them both. I succeeded after some difficulty, and they agreed to remain. "That fellow said he'd come back in an hour to see that we had gone," said Martha, a woman with a great deal of spirit. "I hope he will come," and she nodded her head with an emphasis which promised him a warm reception. "I don't expect you'll see him here again. Now, a last question. Did they say anything to you about the supposed crime for which I was to be arrested?" "They went on awful about you, sir," replied Martha. "You was a conspirator and a murderer, and you'd either run away to get out of their hands or had killed yourself, and I don't know what else, but you were never coming back, that was certain. Well, here I am, you see, so you can tell how much to believe of the rest." "They said they had warrants for you, sir," put in Ellen. "They showed me some papers, and the Fraulein told me afterwards they had, and that she was going away in order to prevent any harm coming to you." "Well, we'll soon have things all right again," I replied, and went off to change my clothes and view the results of the men's work. I thought I could understand it all. I guessed that the man who had fired at me on the previous night had mistaken my fall for the result of his shot, and had accordingly reported that the attempt had been successful. With me out of his way, von Felsen had only to recover possession of the stolen paper, the keys, and the confessions he had written, to find his hand once more on the controlling lever of everything as far as Althea was concerned. That was what the search meant, and that it had been complete the evidence of my own eyes showed, but it had not been successful any the more for that. The stolen paper was safe in Brussels, and I had been in such a cyclone hurry to get after the Baron on the previous night that I had not stayed to look the other things up, but had thrust them into the first place which had caught my eye. This had been the large upright iron stove in the hall among the kindling wood and paper, and there I found them. Almost every other conceivable nook and cranny in the house which would have served for a hiding place had been ransacked, and every desk and drawer opened and searched. It was a stupendous piece of luck. A moment's reflection decided me to leave them where they were. My first task must be to find Althea. Her safety was much more to me than my own, and she was not safe for a single second of the time she was with Von Felsen. It was an easy guess that his failure to find what he had sought so drastically would put him in a very ugly mood, and even his belief in my death would not suffice to ease his mind. So long as that evidence of his crimes remained in existence, it was liable to fall into the hands of someone who would be able to use it with disastrous results to him. I would have given much to know the story he had told to Althea. He would not say a word about my supposed death, and the servant's references to the warrants for my arrest suggested the line he had taken. He would seek to prey upon her fears, both for her father and myself, and pose as being still in a position to save us both. If he had done that, I had no doubt that he would drive her to consent to marry him, and my fear was that, exasperated by not having found what he sought and needed so desperately, he would rush matters to a crisis at once. I hurried at once to Von Felsen's house, but only to find it shut up. I knocked and rang several times without result, and in the end had to turn away baffled and a prey to fresh fears and apprehension. Where to look for him I had no idea, nor where to look for Althea, of course. I had felt so certain of finding them both at the house that the sting of the disappointment was all the more disconcerting. It flashed across my thoughts that probably Althea might have gone back to her own house, or might have communicated with Yldz in some way during my absence, and acting on the impulse, I jumped back into the cab and told the man to drive me there. On the way, another thought occurred to me. Hagar Ziegler. She might know where to tell me to look for Von Felsen, and I was putting my head out of the window to give the driver the fresh direction when we pulled up at Yldz's house. As I should lose no more than a few minutes in seeing her, I ran up to the door, and when the servant opened it, I sprang up the stairs without wasting the time to be announced, dashed into her room, and without an apology for my abruptness, asked if Althea had been there. Yldz jumped to her feet on my entrance, stared at me as if I were a lunatic, and then backed and laid her hand on the bell-pull. "Why do you come here? I can't help you, Herr Bastable. You must know that. You can answer my question at any rate. Fräulein Althea is missing from my house, and I am searching for her. Has she been here?" She fixed her eyes on me with an expression of bewilderment. "She can't help you to escape, and of all houses in Berlin, this is the last you should have come to. For heaven's sake, do give me an answer. Can't you see I am on fire with impatience? Every minute may mean ruin to her." She bent toward me and came a step or two forward. "Do you mean you don't know? You must not stay here. It will ruin me if you are found here. Do you mean that you don't know?" "Know what?" I cried angrily in my exasperation. "Good heavens! Why, that you are accused of the murder of Hagar Ziegler's father." End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of An Imperial Marriage by Arthur W. Marchmont. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Deon Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. Once again in the Toils. When Yldz's appeal to me to leave the house at once elicited no response from me, I was indeed too staggered for the moment by her news, and sat groping blindly for some clue to its real significance. Her eager insistence gave way to despair at the thought of the possible consequences to herself. "You will ruin me," she cried vehemently, and throwing herself on to a couch, she burst into an hysterical flood of tears. She could have used no stronger weapon, and I pulled myself together. I knew her grief was utterly self-centered, but the sight of her tears had that dismaying effect which most men will appreciate, so I rose at once. "Tell me quickly all you know, and I'll go," I said, "and the sooner you tell me, the sooner I shall be away." This had the desired effect. She choked down her ready sobs. "Fräulein Ziegler telephoned to the Steiners, the people of the house here, about half an hour ago, to ask if you had been here, and the daughter came up to ask me where you were, adding that you were wanted by the police for that awful thing. For heaven's sake, don't let them find you here. They will connect me in—" "Never mind that," I cut in abruptly. "They won't do anything of the sort. I had no hand in it at all. Fräulein Ziegler herself knows that perfectly well. But there is something you must do at once. Fräulein Althea has disappeared from my house, and I am searching for her." "She is not here, and has not been here," she interrupted. "And if they find you—" "Not a thought for Althea, everything for herself. Listen, please, and then do what I tell you. I want to tell her that her father is lying ill in a farmhouse, and that she must go at once to see to him and bring him back to the city. As she has been taken away, you must go and care for him." And I told her where and how to find the Baron. But she burst into vehement protests. "Why should I go? It is Althea's matter. He is not my father. He has never done anything for me. Why then should I run this risk? Where should I take him?" In disgust at this incessant note of self, I resumed my seat and said curtly, "I will wait here while you settle that." "You wish to ruin me," she cried again. "No, I am only warning you. If some one does not go to him and take care that he is placed in safety, he will do some mad thing, and then you will be ruined." "But what can I do? He would not come with me. Oh, you are cruel. You know how helpless I am. No one thinks of me. Althea should be here." "You can go out and stay with him, paying the people there to look after him until I can arrange something else." "Stay with him? Are you mad? My concert, my practicing, Herr Grumpel. There will be no concert for you if he breaks loose. There will be a prison instead for you as well as for the rest of us." "But you? Why do you not go?" "I have to find Fräulein Althea. She would not have you sacrifice my future in this way. Oh, how selfish you all are, all in league against me. I have warned you, and can do no more now. If you do not go out and arrange for him to be kept safely where he is, you may as well leave Germany by the next train, for all the hope you will ever have of succeeding here. That is my last word. If you wish to sing at that concert, you will go instantly and do what I have said." I turned to leave her then, and as I reached the door it was opened quickly from without, and a woman of about 30 entered. She started at seeing me, and stood holding the handle of the door and staring at me. "Fräulein Steiner!" exclaimed Challis in some dismay. "Lotte told me Herr Bastable was here. I came to see." "Yes, I am Herr Bastable. I beg your pardon," she said, nervously stepping back and making as if to close the door again. "I will come with you," I said, following her out. "Probably you wish to telephone to Fräulein Ziegler that I am here. With your permission I will speak to her myself." She was trembling a little. She asked me to let her know, she faltered. She is holding the phone now. She will recognize my voice over the wire. I will save you the trouble. A very serious mistake has been made. And when we reached the hall, I went to the instrument at once. Are you there? Who is that? Came the reply in Hagar's voice. Mr. Bastable, I am just leaving the house here, Frau Steiner's. I must see you at once. I have just learnt that you have been deceived in regard to me, and I can tell you the whole truth about your father's death, and can put the proofs of what I have to say into your hands. I do not blame you for what you have done, but before you do any more, please see me. What have you to say? It is too late now. It will be too late if you do not see me at once. It is about Herr von Felsen. You will repent it all your life if you do not see me. Wait a moment. I heard the faint echo of a conversation, and then she asked, Will you come here? Who is with you? There was another pause. Herr von Felsen, she replied. Then, to my infinite surprise and relief, Yes, I will come at once. Wait a minute. He wishes to speak to you himself. Of course I will, I replied eagerly. I waited, but no sound came over the wire, and when I spoke there was no reply. In a flash I saw the plan. I dropped the receiver and hurried out of the house on the instant. The intention was to keep me at the instrument until the police would have time to come and arrest me. I jumped into the first cab I met and drove by a circuitous route to my own house. As they believed they could put their hand on me at once, I calculated that I should have time to get home, change into some sort of disguise, get the papers from their hiding place, and set out in search of Althea. Von Felsen's presence at Hagar's house had at first baffled me as completely as this last move, the preposterous charge of murder, but I began to see the meaning of all. He had probably found difficulty in dealing with Althea, and had also heard that the previous night's attempt on my life had failed. This had cornered him. He knew that his breach of faith would cause me to denounce him, and in this desperation he had resolved to charge me with the murder and thus get me held by the police. This would give him the time he needed to carry out his plan with regard to Althea. It meant more than even that to him, indeed. It would both prejudice any statement I might make impugning him, and at the same time very probably enable his father's agents to regain possession of the confessions he had made. It was a very ominous outlook, but it had a redeeming feature. If my reading of the case were right, it was clear that so far Althea was safe, and the reasons which had forced him to leave her while he returned to Hagar to use the latter in this way were likely to be strong enough to prevent his purpose with her until he could satisfy her of my actual danger. In other words, until he had secured my arrest and could carry to her the proofs from the police themselves. But it was only a question of a few hours at most. If I remained in the city, I should soon be caught, and remain I must, of course. My first thought was to get the papers which were of such vital import, and take them straight to Herr Borsen or to Felderman, but there was a risk to Althea in that which alarmed me. If von Felsen heard of it, and he was almost sure to learn it immediately, he would be driven to bay, and in that mood ready to do her any violence. I guessed that in regard to her he was calculating that, if he could once force her to become his wife, I should hold my hand rather than bring all the shame and trouble upon her, consequent upon his having to answer for the murder of the old Jew. And the problem I had to face was how to use the hour or two of freedom so as to find the means of checkmating his designs upon Althea. I could see only one way, through Hagar herself. If she had not been hopelessly poisoned against me by von Felsen's story, I was confident that I could work upon her jealousy and set her to hound him down, and thus prevent mischief. By the time I reached my house, I had a crude sort of plan. Among the relics of my private theatrical days, I had a suit of workman's overalls, and dressed in these and carrying a small bag of tools, I could manage to escape the notice of any of the police to whom my face was not too familiar. I told the two servants that, as I was now in some trouble, they had better leave the house at once. Then I hunted up the disguise, slipped the overalls over my own clothes, secured the papers, and set off to find Hagar. As I hurried along in the direction of her house, I had to pass my old office, and the thought occurred to me to put the papers I carried into safe hands. Bassett was the very man for such a purpose. So I went up to him and explained that I was likely to be arrested on a false charge. I wished him to hold them for me until I could communicate with him again. This precaution would, at any rate, frustrate the efforts of von Felsen to get hold of them. To obtain an interview with Hagar was a very different matter, however. I hung about the house for some time at my wits' end for an excuse to get inside, and when at length I began to fear that my movements would be regarded as suspicious, I put as bold a face on matters as I could, and rang the bell intending to ask for her openly. Just as the servant opened the door, I changed my tactics. "I'm sorry to have been so long in coming, but the boss kept me. I'll soon put it all right, however," I said coolly, and stepped inside. The girl stared at me as if I were a lunatic. "What is it?" she asked. "This is Fräulein Ziegler's, isn't it?" "Yes, of course, but what do you want?" "She has just telephoned to the exchange that something is wrong with one of the instruments." "Is it the office one?" "What is that, Rebecca?" It was Hagar's voice. "There is a man here who says he has come to see to the telephone," was the reply as the servant went toward her mistress. "I'll soon have it right," I declared, and took advantage of the moment to step into the office. I knew the way well enough, of course. "There is a mistake somewhere," said Hagar, and as I had calculated, she followed me into the office. I began to fool about with the instrument, keeping my back to her for the moment. "We had a message," I growled, altering my voice, and speaking in a tone of a man with a grievance. "There is nothing the matter with that," she said quickly, crossing to me. "I'll see to it all right," I mumbled, bending over the instrument. "I tell you it's a mistake," she rapped back sharply and tapped me on the shoulder. "Don't meddle with it." I affected to take umbrage at this. "Oh, all right," I muttered, and crossed to the door as if in a huff. A glance showed me that the servant had gone, so I shut the door and turned around. She recognized me instantly. Her lips moved as if uttering my name, but no sound came. She flashed one rapid glance over my workman's garb, and her eyes lighted angrily as they met mine in a long steady stare, while she was thinking what to do. "I have come prepared to answer the charge Herr von Felsen has induced you to bring against me, but we must have a square talk first. Then you can send for the police if they are not already in the house." She did not take her eyes from mine while I spoke, and made no reply. Her eyes were as hard as flints, and my task began to look hopeless. "I see you have made up your mind, yet you might remember that I saved your life that night." Her lip curled, the only comment, but more eloquent than many words. "I know the whole truth about that night's black work, and what brought those men to your house." Her agitation and rage were mounting fast, and after a pause she burst out bitterly. "Of course you do. The chief of them slept that night in your house, and has been concealed there ever since. Do you dare to deny it?" Whom do you mean? Her lip curled again, and she shrugged her shoulders. You mean Baron von Ringham? Von Felsen has told you that? She gave an impatient gesture. It is the truth that matters, not how I know it, she retorted. On the contrary, his motive is everything. But he kept that to himself, of course. Did he tell you that he came here with these lies in order to get you to accuse me, so that he should have time to force Baron von Ringham's daughter to marry him? You lie, she cried fiercely. You were seen to enter and leave this house shortly before I met you that night. The ring I saw on your finger was his, and he had left it with my father that afternoon. And if that is not enough proof, one of your associates has shot himself, leaving behind him a confession that he and you together murdered my father in revenge for his supposed betrayal of you. Do you think I have forgotten your agitation when I recognized the ring? Von Felsen had told his story cunningly, and what she had termed my agitation at her recognition of the ring on the night of the murder lent color to it. My conduct was quite open to such a misconstruction as she had placed upon it. But there was no time to attempt to shake her conviction by argument. I paused a second in doubt as to the line to adopt, and she read this hesitation for guilt. You cannot answer me, but you shall pay the price. If you persist in this folly, it is you who will pay the price. Von Felsen went to my house today in my absence and compelled Fraulein von Ringham to go with him and consent to become his wife upon certain conditions. In order to be able to appear to be in a position to fulfill these conditions, he came here to you to get me arrested on this ridiculous charge. No one in the whole empire knows better than he that there is not a glint of truth in the story, but you have fallen into the trap, and within an hour of my arrest, Fraulein von Ringham will be his wife. It is false, she exclaimed vehemently. Tonight we are to be married. I smiled. Where is he? Set him face to face with me and force him to let her be present, and you will see. This fired her jealousy. It is false, she cried again, but her tone was less vehement, and her eyes signaled doubt. You may say this to turn my anger against him, that you may escape. You shall not. Can you find him? He is not in his house in the Korsenstrasse. He knew I should seek him there. Can you take me to him? She paused, and then with a hard, contemptuous smile replied, so that you may find a chance to escape on the way. I can trust you no longer. Did I not come here knowing full well the charge you have made against me? Should I have come if I were guilty? Be reasonable. I do not trust you, she repeated. It is sheer madness, I cried in desperation. You are wasting hours that may mean everything to both of us for all our lives. Name what conditions you please, and I will accept them. I will go to him with you under arrest, if you like. Will that prove to you I am in earnest? She paused, and then nodded eagerly. Yes, if you dare to do that. I crossed to the phone to call up Felderman. She watched me closely, and as I passed her, shrank out of my way lest I should touch her. I affected not to notice the gesture, and stood at the instrument with my back to her. But the next instant I heard her open the door and turn to meet her eyes fixed on me with a glance of vindictive triumph. You shall be arrested, as you say, she cried, and rushed away, slamming the door behind her. Just then the answer came through. Is that Herr Felderman? Yes, what is it? Who are you? Mr. Bastable, I am at Ziegler's house, and have heard I am charged with having murdered him. Can you come at once? I have Charged with what? The tone was one of intense astonishment. Murder. I want you here at once. "Are you out of your mind? There's no such charge." I heard no more, for the door was flung open, and 2 men in police uniform rushed in and dragged me violently away from the telephone as Hagar followed. "That is the man. I charge him with the murder of my father," she cried. Too late, I saw the trap into which I had walked. "These are not the police," I protested to her. "I have telephoned to Herr Felderman. This is a trap. They are von Felsens." "We'll show you if we're not the police," cried one of them as he slipped a pair of handcuffs on my wrists. "No more talking here." And he whipped out a revolver and ordered me to hold my tongue and go with them. "Bring her on to the station to make the charge there," he added to a 3rd man who had entered. I shouted a last protest to Hagar, but a hand was clapped over my mouth, and I was hurried out of the house toward a carriage which was waiting at a few yards' distance. At that moment a motor car came slowly along the street and passed me as I walked between the 2 men in uniform. I called out, and this drew the eyes of the occupants upon me. One was von Felsen, who leered at me in triumph, and by his side sat Althea, pale and distressed at seeing me thus handcuffed in the hands of the police. As she fell back, burying her face in her hands, the chauffeur quickened the speed of the car, and it whisked round a corner just as I was bundled into the carriage. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of An Imperial Marriage by Arthur W. Marchmont. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Deon Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. Dragen Again. I had made a pretty mess of things, and now that it was too late, I began to appreciate what a fool I had been. Von Felsen had outplayed me at every point, and chance and my own folly had helped him to score a complete victory. The charge of murder was the merest bluff, and he had imposed upon Hagar for the purpose very cleverly. He had probably found Althea unexpectedly resolute not to yield to his wishes without some actual proof of my arrest, and had then vamped the charge through Hagar, and planned that Althea should see me in the hands of men in police uniform. He had calculated that, relying upon my ability to clear myself of the charge in Hagar's eyes, I should go at once to her to get her assistance in tracking Althea, and I had walked straight into the trap. I had of course been closely shadowed, and as soon as I had reached Hagar's house he had been informed, and had brought Althea in the car to be a witness of the arrest. With one cunning stroke he had thus got rid of me, had convinced Althea of my arrest, and probably freed himself from the embarrassment of Hagar at the same time. I did not doubt that the men he had taken to her house would see that she gave no sort of trouble. These thoughts flashed through my mind in the few seconds after I was in the carriage, together with some exceedingly disquieting speculations on my own plight. It was about as bad as it could be, but I was not going to give up all hope without an effort. The men thrust me into a corner of the back seat, and one of them held a revolver close to my head, threatening to fire if I made any trouble. But this did not scare me as badly as they thought. I knew they would not dare to shoot me in the street. Their own safety would be endangered, and the risk was too great for them to run it except in the last resort. I affected to be very frightened, however, and waited for a chance to try and attract attention and bring help. The opportunity came as the carriage had to stop when crossing one of the main streets. With a sudden kick, I broke the glass of the window near me and gave a yell for help. The fellow opposite seized my legs, while his companion thrust his hand over my mouth. But I wrestled violently, and in the midst of the struggle a policeman's head appeared at the window of the carriage. "What's the matter here?" he asked. "I think you'd better get in and give us a hand," answered one of my guards very coolly. "He's a lunatic. Just cut his wife's throat." The man's coolness and his uniform had the effect of quieting all suspicion. "All right. Strap his legs and gag him, why don't you? Don't let him make that racket." I got my head free then. "I am an Englishman. These are not," I began when I was silenced again. "He's been yelling that all the time," was the reply, with an oath and a laugh. "I wish you'd lend a hand. We don't want to hurt him." "I can't come. Drive on there," he told the coachman, and on we went. As soon as the policeman's face disappeared from the window, the fellow at my side flung me heavily back into the corner of the carriage, and together they fastened a large handkerchief over my mouth, one of them twisting his fingers into it so tightly behind my head that I was powerless to open my lips. And he held me in this fashion for nearly all the rest of the drive. Further resistance was now out of the question. I made my effort, and it had failed, and all I could do was to keep still and wait with such resignation as I could summon for what was to come to me. If I escaped with my life, I should have reason to be thankful. I had already had ample proof that the men whom von Filzen employed were quite capable of going to any extreme. My life had been attempted more than once, and at the time of the previous abduction, when I had not been nearly so dangerous to him as now, I had only escaped death by the narrowest of margins. Yet it was not for myself that I was mainly afraid now. Von Filzen had so planned things that Althea had been persuaded of my arrest, and I could not doubt for an instant that she would at once agree to do anything he demanded. That night she would certainly consent to the marriage, and the thought was like the sear of a hot iron on a nerve. Compared with the agony of that dread, nothing else seemed to matter. I would cheerfully have given my life to have saved her from such a fate, but even if I lost my life now, I should be powerless to help her. Maddened by this reflection, I made another and desperate struggle with my captors. Wrenching myself free from the gag which held me like a vice, I fought and kicked and writhed, yelling for help at the top of my lungs all the while in a furious effort to escape. But it was useless. Both were strong men, and they overpowered me and forced me down, this time onto the floor of the carriage, and held me there until we stopped. 1 point only did I gain by the effort. One of the handcuffs came unfastened and could not be relocked on my wrist. But this did not help me much. One of the brutes seized my arms and held them behind my back and twisted them till I thought the very sinews would break. I did not give in until my strength was utterly exhausted and my head reeled dizzily, and in this condition, with no power left for resistance, I was hauled out and carried rapidly into a house. There I was gagged again, my arms and legs were tied, and I was flung down on the floor of an empty room, the door of which was locked upon me. Bruised and sore from head to foot although I was, and aching in every muscle of my body, I thought nothing of my hurts. I was on fire with impotent rage and belated repentance for my stupidity. Only an hour or two before I had had the upper hand. There was apparently nothing to prevent my gaining a complete victory. If I had only gone straight to Felderman or Herr Borsen, von Filzen would now have been grovelling at my feet, begging for mercy. What a credulous fool I had been to believe for an instant that that ridiculous charge of murder had really been made. what I would not have given to have been able to set the clock back for those few hours. Gnashing my teeth at my idiotic blundering, I passed hours of torture. I was left alone, except that now and again the door was opened, and someone came in with a lantern to see that I was still securely fastened. I abandoned all hope, and each time I heard the key turned in the lock, I made up my mind that someone was coming to take my life. I grew utterly reckless also, and slowly a fresh thought began to take shape in my mind. Save my life I could not, but if a chance came, I would at least send one of the scoundrels who had taken a hand in the business to his last account. It was just a wild impulse to have revenge, but I hugged it close to my heart till it became my one cherished object, the one thing I could do before they took my life. That thirst for revenge, that lust for blood, if you like, put strength into me, gave tone to my nerves and purpose to my thoughts, when all else in that hour of black despair had failed. I began to test the strength of the bonds which held me, and gradually to loosen them slightly, as I tugged at the cords which bound my arms, and strove with frantic struggles to ease the pressure of those on my legs. The exertion brought the sweat of effort and pain to my brow, but I was nearly what they had termed me, a madman, in my furious desire for revenge, and although every movement racked and tortured me, I did not cease until I had so far succeeded that the blood began to flow freely once more in my veins. Faint and exhausted, at last, with the struggle, I was lying quiet, to regain strength for a further effort, when the key was turned on the lock once more. This time 2 men entered, the gag was taken from my mouth, and I was ordered roughly to sit up. I took no notice of this. It was my cue to affect to be helpless. One of them dragged me to the wall and propped me up in a sitting posture, while the other held the lantern close to my face. A movement of the light enabled me to see his face, and I recognized him. He was Dragen, the man who had carried me off before. "Ah, you know me, I see," he said with a chuckle. "That will save trouble, perhaps, as you'll know I'm not likely to let you fool me a second time." The wild desire to take life, which had so possessed me before, now focused into a set purpose that his should be the life, and I lowered my eyes quickly, lest he should read something of the thought in my mind. "You know what we want, Mr. Englishman, and what we mean to have. Those papers, where are they?" I made no reply, and he thrust his hands into all my pockets to search for them. A bitter oath showed his disappointment. I smiled in triumph, and this so exasperated him that he struck me in the face. Then I understood why I was still alive. Until those papers were regained, Von Felsen knew that he would be in danger of losing everything, despite his present victory over me. "You are a brave fellow, Dragen, to strike a helpless man." He raised his hand to repeat the blow, but his companion stopped him. "What's the good of that?" he said gruffly. "You know what we were told." "Hold your tongue, curse you," cried Dragen. "I mean to get them, and shall go my own way to do it. Where are they?" he demanded of me. "What papers do you mean?" "To hell with your questioning me. You know what I mean. Where are they?" "You think you can make me tell you?" "I'm sure I can," he retorted with an oath. "Try then," and I looked up and met his angry eyes firmly. "Give them up, and no harm shall come to you." "This looks like it, doesn't it?" "Don't you anger me, or it'll be the worse for you." "You can only take my life, but even then you can't save your employers, nor your own, for the police know all about that other affair. You'll be short of breath long before you get a chance of saying any more about that or this." "That's only what I know already. If I were to tell you where the papers are, I might whistle for a chance of getting out of this. But I'll tell you one thing. They are in the hands of those who will know how to use them, whether I am alive or dead, by this time tomorrow morning. Do what you will." This infuriated him, and he seized and shook me violently in an uncontrollable frenzy of rage, and then flung me down violently on the floor. He caused me severe pain, but except for this, the rough handling benefited me rather than him. He had seized me by the arms, and the cords on my wrists were perceptibly slacker for the severe shaking. My head struck the floor heavily when he threw me down, and I lay still as a corpse, letting all my muscles relax and breathing as slightly as possible, that he should think I was on the verge of unconsciousness. He questioned me again about the papers, but I gave no sign that I even heard him. And when he kicked me and then tugged at my arms and lifted my head in the effort to rouse me, I made no sign of life. The second man was scared at this. "You've done for him now," he muttered. "Serve him right," growled Dragen, with a savage oath. "He'd tricked me before. But what about serving me? What's the good of this to me? How are we going to earn the money with him in this state?" Dragen swore again and was aiming a vicious kick at my head, when his companion stopped him so suddenly that he overbalanced and fell to the ground close to me. In the fall, something dropped from his pocket and rolled near me. It was a small sheath knife, and to my infinite delight neither man saw it. Dragen rose in a rage, and a fierce quarrel broke out between the two. This enabled me to shift my position unobserved, so that I first lay on the knife, and then rolled forward till my hands could reach it, when I tucked it up underneath the back of my waistcoat. The quarrel ended without blows, and presently they drew aside and talked together in low muttered tones, the purport of which I could not hear. After a time they crossed and looked at me, and the fellow who had been protecting me from Dragen's violence knelt down and tried to feel my pulse. He was clumsy at the business, however, and could not find it. "I believe you've finished him," he muttered, and laid me down gently at full length, and loosened the cords on both wrists and legs, and began to chafe my limbs to restore circulation. "That's better," he said at length, feeling again for my pulse and finding it this time. "Get him some brandy or something, but you'd better do what I said, Dragen," he added, rising. "If those papers are in safe hands, as he said, we'd better know what to do next." The man's evident alarm infected Dragen. "Curse the whole business," he growled uneasily. "That won't help us far. If you hadn't been in such a devil of a rage, this wouldn't have happened." Then he knelt down by me again. "Can you hear me?" he asked anxiously. "No harm will come to you. Can you hear me?" My reply was the faintest of faint moans. "He's coming round all right. Get him some brandy, and don't let him see you, and we'll have him round all right," he said in a tone of great relief as he rose once more. "I'm for fetching him. Let's see what the others say," he declared as he picked up the lantern. "We must know what to do next." There was another conference, and then they went away together, leaving the door unfastened. In another moment I had slipped my hands out of the cords, which had been so considerately loosened, and with the knife I cut those which bound my legs. Then I kicked off my boots, and stole out of the room in my stockinged feet, resolved to make a fight for my freedom. The passage outside the room was in darkness, but I knew in which direction I had been carried into the room, and crept noiselessly toward the front door of the house. But there was a room between, the door of which stood open. I heard the voices of the men there, and one of them was standing close to the door. To pass this meant a great risk of being either seen or heard, and as I hesitated whether to take the chance, I caught fragments of the talk. They were discussing the advisability of fetching someone or of going to someone for further instructions in view of my statement about the papers being in the hands of those who would use them. Presently the man by the door, interested in the discussion, went a little way into the room, and I seized that moment to creep past. The house had double doors, and the inner one was pressed back against the wall. I ran my fingers slightly up and down the outer one, searching for the fastenings, when a general scuffling of feet in the room announced that the men were moving, having apparently come to a decision. I slipped back and hid behind the inner door, and held my breath as they came out into the passage, talking excitedly. The suspense of those few moments was more trying than words can describe. I had failed to find the means of opening the front door, and if they went back into the room where I had been lying, I should be caught like a rabbit in a snare. The instant I was discovered, my life would not be worth a spent match. They stood wrangling in the passage for a time that seemed an age to me in my excited suspense, and every second I expected one or the other of them to go back to the room and then announce my flight. "Well, let's have a look at the beggar first and see if we can't drag it out of him," said one, whose voice I recognized as that of the man who had been standing by the door. They moved in a body toward the room. My heart sank, and I gave myself up for lost. My only chance, and that the faintest and feeblest, was that I might seize the moment of respite to get the door of the house open. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of An Imperial Marriage by Arthur W. Marchmont. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Deon Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. Just in time. But just when matters appeared to be at their worst, the luck turned. The man who had prevented Dragen before intervened now. "You can get him some brandy, and he'll be all right." "Where is it?" came the reply, and there was a pause. "I shan't wait," said the former speaker again. "I shall take the risk of going. Fritz is just below with the horses. If there's any violence before we get back, you'll have to answer for it." "Answer to hell," growled Dragen fiercely. "I shall split on the whole thing, if there is. Mind that," retorted the other in quite as angry a tone, and he passed my hiding place, opened the door, and went out. He tried to close it sharply behind him, but I took a risk at that moment and thrust my foot in the way. Fortunately, he was in too bad a temper to care whether he left it open or shut, and ran down the steps. Someone laughed. "Pig-headed fool," growled Dragen. "Would he split?" asked another nervously. "Perhaps the beggar's well enough to talk now. Let's see." "Bring the lantern," said another, and the shuffling of feet followed. I dared not wait any longer, and moreover I had another plan now than merely to escape. I guessed that the man I was following meant to go to Von Felsen, and I meant him to take me with him. I opened the door stealthily and slipped out. The carriage was some 20 yards away, and I darted toward it. My lack of boots rendered my footfalls absolutely silent, and I reached it, unseen and unheard, just as the man had got in and was turning to shut the door. In the darkness he mistook me for one of his companions. "Coming after all, are you?" he asked. I jumped in, and he himself closed the door with a slam, and the carriage started. Before he had time to see his mistake, my hand was on his throat, and my knife threatened him. "If you care for your life, keep silent," I cried between my clenched teeth. For a few moments, precious as gold to me, surprise kept him quiet. I knew that my escape must already have been discovered, and I expected to hear the cries and shouts of the rest calling to us to stop. Then he began to struggle. "Keep still," I said fiercely. "I mean you no harm, but if you try to resist, I'll plunge this into your heart as surely as there is a living God." At that moment came the cries behind us, which I had feared, and the driver began to check the horses. "Tell him to drive on, or you'll not live another second," I hissed, releasing my grip on his throat so that he could speak. He hesitated, and I raised the knife higher as if to strike. "It's all right, Fritz. Get on as fast as you can," he called. I drew a breath of intense relief. I had him now, and he was in deadly fear for his life. I ran my hand quickly over him and found his revolver and took it. "Have you a knife?" His hand went to it. "Throw it on the front seat there." He obeyed me, and I tossed it out of the window. Then I sat down opposite to him and let him get back his scared wits. He stared at me helplessly, cowed by the suddenness of the attack and overawed by the weapon in which I kept him covered. I, in my turn, watched him quite as closely while I considered what line to take. That he was going to Von Felsen I had convinced myself, and I meant to go with him if I had to compel him to lead the way with my pistol at his head. But I had no wish to use force if any other means could be found. I was not without hope of this. His fear about the money reward being lost if I came to harm, his squeamishness on the score of violence, his threat to tell what he knew, and his ready submission now, all tended to suggest that he was of a very different type of scoundrel from Dragen and the rest. I gave him 5 minutes in which to pull himself together, and then open fire. "You've made a pretty bad mess of all this," I said sharply. He gave an uneasy start at the sound of my voice, but did not reply. "You were in the thing to take my life, you know, and you can probably see your finish by now." "I didn't threaten your life. Dragen would have done for you just now, when you were insensible, if I hadn't stopped him," he answered after a pause. "I wasn't insensible. I know what passed." "Then you know what I say is true," he said with a note of eagerness. "Yes, I know it." I paused to see if he would volunteer anything more. He did not, however. "If you like to answer my questions, I may make things easier for you. Where are we going?" He paused a long time before replying. "What are you going to do with me?" "Shoot you if you try any pranks. Hand you over to the police if you force me. Give you your liberty and pay you well if you come over to my side in the affair and make a clean breast of the whole thing." He chewed this in silence for a while and then asked, "How do I know that?" "The first two you can judge for yourself. The last you'll have to take on trust. You can please yourself. How much were you to make by this job?" 500 marks. But it wasn't only the money. Dragen has the whip hand of me. He'll want all his hands for himself after this, and you'll stand by his side in the dock, unless you go in the witness box against him. Tell all you know, and you shall not have 500, but 1,000 marks. They'd have my life. Not if you leave the country. I'll add the passage money to America. You're not tough enough for a real scoundrel, you know, and you'll get a fresh start there. I shouldn't be in it at all if it weren't for Dragen and the gambling. Well, you must make up your mind quickly." "I'll do it," he said, after another long pause, drawing a deep breath. "But you must keep me safe from the rest until it's over." And then he began to tell me. He said his name was Lander, and that he had been forced into the affair by Dragen. He had been one of the men who had made the search for the papers at my house, and afterwards had played the part of a plain-clothes police officer at Hager's, where he found out that von Felsen was at the back of everything. The latter's orders had been to recover possessions of the papers at any cost, and when that had been done, I was to be kept a close prisoner for a week. But von Felsen's terms had been no papers, no pay, and thus my declaration that they were in safe hands had caused a split and a quarrel, and Lander and one of the others had decided to go back to von Felsen for fresh instructions. He had barely finished his story when the carriage stopped at von Felsen's house. Remembering that I had found it close shut when I was there before, I was surprised to see lights in several of the windows. I concluded that he had thought it safe to return there when he knew that I had fallen into Dragen's hands. We got out, and I told Lander to ask for von Felsen and say that we had a message from Dragen, and when the servant opened the door, I stood on one side and kept my face out of the light. The fellow was inclined to be suspicious, and was going to shut the door in our faces on the pretense of going to call his master, when I lurched against Lander, pushed him into the house, and followed. Answering the servant's protests with a drunken oath, I staggered to a chair and flopped into it. He stared at me for a moment, hesitating whether to try and put me out, and then knocked at the door of von Felsen's private room. The sound of several voices reached us as he opened it, and after a pause von Felsen came out. I let my head loll forward so that he should not at first see my face, and he spoke to Lander. "Who are you, and what do you want?" he asked sharply. Having no cue from me, the man was at a loss for a reply, so he motioned toward me and muttered something about the papers. "Turn up the light in the library," he told the servant, and then to us, "Come in here," and he led the way. I rose and staggered after them, lurching first against the servant as he came out of the room, and then against von Felsen, who stood holding the door. In this way I shouldered him into the room, and then shut the door. "Who is this drunken beast?" cried von Felsen, as I was fumbling with the door fastening. Then I turned and faced him and waited for the recognition. I was not surprised that it did not follow at once. I had on the suit of workman's overalls. They were torn and disheveled as the result of the scrimmage with Dragen. I was as dirty as a sweep. A soft, rather greasy cloth cap was drawn well down over my face. I was bootless, and had just been assuming drunkenness. I have no doubt I looked a very low-grade sort of scoundrel. "Why do you bring this fellow here?" he demanded of Lander angrily. "Have another look at me, von Felsen," I said quietly, fixing my eyes on him and crossing toward him. He fell back from me as if I were the devil in the flesh, and leant against the table behind him, staring at me wide-eyed, breathing hard, deathly white, speechless, and shaking like a jelly. I was human enough to enjoy his discomfiture, and just stared at him while he tortured himself with the thoughts which my most unwelcome arrival had started. Lander glanced from one to the other of us in perplexity, and for more than a minute the tense silence was unbroken. Then von Felsen clasped his hands to his head with a faint groan of agony. "Where is Fraulein von Ringham?" I asked. At the sound of my voice he glanced up at me, and then cowered and shrank like a beaten cur. The silent gesture chilled me with sudden dread. My confidence and the sense of victory fell away from me like a dropped cloak. I was too late after all. A frenzy of rage seized upon me. I rushed upon him, and seizing him by the throat, shook him till his teeth chattered, and flung him away, and sent him asprawl to the ground. "You shall pay with your life for this," I cried fiercely. "Go for the police, Lander," I said, turning to my companion. "Here, take this card to Herr Felderman," and I scribbled a message to Felderman to come. No, wait," said von Felsen in a weak voice as he struggled to his feet. Wait till we have talked together." "We've passed the time for talk," I answered with an oath. "Where is Fraulein Althea?" "Send him away," and he motioned toward Lander. "Where is she?" I asked again. I'm not safe to fool in this mood. I was beside myself with the lust for revenge, and could have found it in me to tear the life out of him there and then. This is the end of things for you. I will tell you all. Send him away. She is safe and well. Wait in the hall there till I call you, I told Lander, and I unlocked the door, let him out, and relocked it. "Now, you treacherous devil, out with the truth," I thundered. "Have you forced her to marry you? If you have, I swear on my soul that you shall pay for it with your life." He fell back before me, grey and sweat-dappled with terror. "For God's sake," he exclaimed, "I admit everything." "Tell me," I stormed. "She is in the room across there with the others." "Come then," and I twisted my fingers into his collar and hauled him toward the door. He hung back and squirmed like a reluctant puppy at the end of the leash. As we reached it, someone knocked sharply on the panels. "Help! Help! I am being murdered!" yelled von Felsen. "Break in this door!" cried a voice. Keeping my grip on his collar, I unlocked the door and threw it open. Herr Borsen and a couple of strangers rushed in, and at the door of the room opposite stood two women with Althea behind them. Borsen did not recognize me, and he and the other men were throwing themselves upon me to rescue von Felsen from my clutches, when Althea broke past the women and called me by name. "Bastable!" exclaimed Borsen with a great start of surprise as he held the others in check. "What on earth is the meaning of this?" I took no notice of him, and hurling von Felsen back into the room, pushed through to Althea and took her hands. "All is well with you?" I asked. "Yes, you came just in time," she cried, pressing my hands and trembling. "But with you I have been mad with fear." "Nothing matters now," I replied, with a smile of intense relief. "I insist on knowing the meaning of your forcing yourself into this house in this disguise, and of your attempt on Herr von Felsen's life, Mr. Bastable," said Borsen angrily, coming up to me. For the moment I could not answer him. The reaction from the furious rage which had maddened me in my fear that I had arrived too late, and the sense of infinite relief at Althea's assurances, rendered me as weak as a girl. I leaned against the lintel of the door and met his angry look with a fatuous smile. Quick to see this, von Felsen made an attempt to get out of the room. "I'll send for the police," he said, with an effort at bluster. This roused me. I pushed him back. "Get me some brandy," I said to Borsen. "I am faint a bit. You shall have all the story you want, but that little beast must stop here." "This is monstrous," cried Borsen indignantly. "Lander, take my message to Herr Felderman. If he wants the police, he shall have them," I added to Borsen. "No, no," cried von Felsen hurriedly. "We'd better talk first." Borsen looked at him keenly, and then at me. "You see," I said. "You needn't go, Lander." Borsen crossed and spoke eagerly to von Felsen, and I turned to Althea, who brought me a glass of wine. I drank it eagerly, and as I handed her back the glass, our hands touched, and our eyes met. "I can scarcely believe it all yet. You are really not hurt?" she asked wistfully. "I've lost my boots, and worn out a pair of socks, but otherwise I'm all right." And I smiled and held up one foot, the sock of which was dangling in tatters. "How can you smile at it like that?" "Because we've won. A narrow margin, but it's a win all right." "But you were in the hands of the police. I saw you." "No, that was only a make-believe. That little brute planned it to deceive you. But he won't do any more planning for a while. They were his men dressed up, and he worked it so that you should see it all for yourself." He told me in the afternoon that you had been arrested, and that he could get you out if I would marry him at once. I insisted on having some proof, and when I saw you tonight, I gave in. These people were here for the marriage, then. I insisted on having witnesses and on hearing from Herr Borsen that what Herr von Felsen had promised would be done. That caused the delay. If you had been half an hour later, von Felsen would have gone to the scaffold. I finished when she paused. Oh, Paul, it's true, but here comes Borsen. You had better go home to Chalice's, I think. I don't want to leave you again. You get into such troubles. I've only lost my boots, I laughed, and at that she smiled too. We had better come to an understanding, Mr. Bastable, said Borsen, coming up then. You know, of course, that you have to explain many things in regard to your association with the Polish plot. Althea started in alarm at this. You can take that threat back, Borsen, or I shall say what I have to say before the rest of the people here, I returned sharply. I didn't mean it as a threat, he replied. So much the better. Let someone see Fräulein von Ringham home, and then we'll talk. The minister who was to have performed the ceremony agreed to go with her, and then Borsen, von Felsen, and I were left alone. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of An Imperial Marriage by Arthur W. Marchmont. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Deon Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. The End. As soon as we three were left alone, I drew an easy chair close to the door, threw myself into it, and begged a cigar from Borsen. Now, Herr Borsen, what has von Felsen told you? I asked sharply. I'm dead beat and want to get to bed. We'll have this thing over as soon as possible. I'm going to let him tell you why he wouldn't allow me to send for Felderman just now, and I'll sit here and check what he says. He can tell you as much as he likes. You don't appear to understand that you have to explain your connection with the Polish party, he retorted. My explanation is easy. I had two objects, one to save the Baron von Ringham, the other to catch von Felsen tripping. I have succeeded in both. He knows that, and more than that, and I can, of course, prove everything. What does this mean? He asked von Felsen, who was staring at me in dire fear about what I meant to tell. I gave him 24 hours in which to get out of the country. Let him tell you under what circumstances. That'll clear the ground. Von Felsen was too frightened to attempt a reply, however, and he sat eyeing us both uneasily and pulling at his fingers with little nervous jerks. The matter's 1,000 times more serious than you think, Borsen, and if I did the right thing, I should send straight for the police and hand him over to them. But if he makes a clean breast of it, and if the things are done which I require, I'm willing to hold my tongue. You think you are in a position to make terms, cried Borsen, with some show of indignation. I don't think it. I know it. You have two things to get into your head. In the first place, that this fellow is a most infernal scoundrel, and that I have found him out. And in the second, that I am in possession of that paper which was stolen from the Count's office, and of the set of duplicate keys which enable the thief to steal it. What do you mean? He was intensely excited on the instant. Look here, and I pointed at von Felsen, who was cowering down in his chair in a condition of abject terror. Do you mean that he... My God, is it possible? He cried, horror-struck. Yes, that is just what I do mean. Let him tell you himself. If he won't, then I will, and I shall add the rest. The rest is blacker still." It was some time before Von Felsen could bring himself to speak, and then he gave a long rambling story of how he had been in Ziegler's power, and had been forced to disclose secret after secret, until the theft of the papers had been the climax. Questions from me brought out the rest, that he had brought Baron von Ringham to Berlin, had let him know where Althea was in order to entrap me, and all the rest of it, including my abduction by Dragen, and the attempts on my life. Borson was almost unnerved. He sat with his head buried in his hands as he listened, and at the end his face was grey and drawn, and he looked across at me with a deep sigh of anguish. "We are in your hands, Mr. Bastable. It will ruin the Count." "There is even worse yet, if it has to be told," I replied grimly. "What are your terms?" "A pardon for Baron von Ringham, and the restoration of his estates. You have already obtained the promise of that, you know, and the clearance of all complications affecting myself. A confession that he lied to Hagar Ziegler in accusing me of her father's murder. A letter from you now that you have heard von Felsen's confession, and a written undertaking that you will be responsible for his safe keeping until all is settled." "You shall have them tomorrow," he said after a pause. "Thank you. I prefer to have them now. But I cannot promise all this on my own account. Then we'll have the police here. I don't mean to lose sight of that scoundrel again until I know where I stand. I must see the Count first. Then see him tonight. You have my last word." "You might take my word of honour, I think." "I don't doubt you, but I'll take nothing but the actual evidence. You might not be able to prevail with the others." "I'll go to him," he agreed. He went at once, and I locked the door behind him and sat smoking in silence. "Do you mean to accuse me of that murder?" asked Von Felsen after a long pause. "Yes, if I don't get my own way, and of everything else." Not another word passed between us until Borson returned after an hour or so and brought what I needed. The rest of the business was very soon completed. I wrote a very short note to Althea, telling her that all was now well, and that I would see her early on the following morning, and then turned to consider my last problem, where to sleep that night. It seemed a very trifling thing indeed, but it was to have consequences none the less. Count von Felsen had insisted upon his son going to his house, and Borson was to take him. I could not stay where I was. I was not inclined to run the risk of going to my own house, lest Dragen, or any of the men with him, should come to make trouble, and in my bootless and generally dishevelled condition I was doubtful of being received into any hotel. I explained the position to Borson, and he agreed to take me in the carriage with him and Von Felsen, and drop me at a hotel where he would vouch for me. Lander accompanied me. The matter was thus soon settled with the hotel people, and Borson returned to the cab. I was just entering the lift, feeling as tired as a dog, when he came rushing back. "He's gone!" he exclaimed excitedly. "Who's gone?" "Von Felsen. He bolted while I was talking to the people here." "Perhaps that's the best way out of it all. Anyway, I'm too dog-tired to look for him tonight. I'll see you in the morning." And with that I left him staring blankly after me as the lift started. It was close to noon before I rose, and I should not have woke then had it not been that someone was thumping vigorously at my door. I opened it and found Felderman waiting impatiently to see me. Dragen had been arrested, and the whole story of my treatment by him and his fellow scoundrels had been told to the police by one of the gang, who had made a full confession. Felderman had been to Borsen, as von Felsen's name had been mentioned, and he had come to me to learn what I should do. I can't tell you yet, I replied. I could not. I wished to see Althea first, and ascertain her wishes as to our movements. For my part, I was anxious to get away from Berlin as soon as possible. The last few days had been quite strenuous enough to satisfy me, and I realized the necessity of putting as great a distance as possible between myself and the Polish party. "Has von Felsen turned up?" I asked him. He shook his head and grinned. "I think we could trace him. I have a clue, but it may not be desirable to follow it up." "Which means?" "I expect you know more than they have told me, but I know enough to make me doubt whether his father is very anxious to see him again. Of course, if you take steps against these men, it may have to come out, the whole of it." "What's the clue?" "That Jew girl, Hagar Ziegler, left the city this morning for Hamburg with a companion. There's a boat sails today for Philadelphia." "And the sex of the companion?" He shrugged his shoulders and smiled significantly. "A woman, apparently, but only one berth has been booked for a woman, by wire, of course, although by a coincidence a steerage passage has been reserved for a male passenger." "And what does Herr Borsen propose to do?" "Nothing. And you?" "Nothing," I replied, adopting the same laconic tone. He looked relieved. "And Dragen and the rest? Are you eager to push the charge hard against them?" "What has Borsen said to you about that?" "Nothing," he said again, looking at me very meaningly. "You have something to say on your own account, then?" "No more than a personal opinion as a friend of yours. I have a sort of idea that if the whole matter were dropped, the other things you wish might be more easily arranged." I understood and smiled. "Is that a bargain?" He nodded. "Speaking as your friend, I should think you may regard it as settled." "The brutes meant to take my life. They ought to be punished." "I think you may leave that to us." "Very well, I will," I agreed. "I'm glad you see it as I do," he said as he rose. "Oh, by the way, are you leaving Berlin?" "Probably. Why?" "Oh, there was a row and some fighting in a riverside warehouse the other evening, and a man was found with a bullet in his head in an open boat." "Suicide?" "I suppose so. No proof of anything else. The affair was political, we think. We caught one or two of those concerned, but some escaped. I don't suppose we shall catch them. They are either out of the country by this time, or will be before we can lay hands on them." "I expect you're right, Felderman. I had an idea that there was something to be done against the Wondervole, you know. She was to have been moored just off that warehouse, and I got Bassett, the man who followed me on my old paper, you know, to print a word of warning from Paris." He gave a little start of surprise. "They wouldn't thank you if they knew, but I don't suppose you'll delay your going to wait for their thanks." And with that he left me. I got up, then borrowed a pair of boots, telephoned to Althea that I had been detained, had my breakfast, and drove to my house and dressed myself in decent clothes, and packed a trunk, and returned with it to the hotel, where I found Borsen awaiting me. He had heard the result of my interview with Felderman, and had come to arrange for the papers to be handed over. "They are in Brussels," I said, "but I am going through there myself, and the little interval will just allow time for your part of the matter to be concluded. By the way, that state concert is tonight, isn't it?" "Yes, and if the new prima pleases the court, it is very likely the announcement of the Baron's pardon will be made by His Majesty, and the more likely because the Prince von Graven will be present with his future bride, the Princess von Altenwald. I suppose you know that the Imperial Marriage is now definitely settled. Everything is going your way. I hope tomorrow that way will be the way toward England, in which case your messenger can meet me in Brussels. You might do worse than take the Baron with you. A temporary absence would be a good thing. I hurried off to Althea with this budget of good news, but only to meet with a disappointment. She was not at home, and Chalise had just returned from a final rehearsal with Herr Grumpel, and was busy with the dressmakers trying on her costume for the evening. She received me with very scant courtesy. She was in high spirits about the concert, but in a bad temper about her dress. I can't see you now, Herr Bastable. I haven't a moment. Where is Althea? I asked. Would you believe that she could have been so inconsiderate as to go rushing off at a time like this, when every minute is precious to get my costume perfect for this evening? I could cry with vexation. No one ever thinks about me, and I have to do everything for myself and for them too. And there isn't the slightest need. At the risk of sacrificing everything, I went out to that horrible farm yesterday and arranged for the Baron to remain there. She has gone to her father, then? Yes, imagine doing such a thing, and all these things here to be settled. And she really has good taste in such things. I do wish people would not be so selfish. I can't understand it. I shall never be ready, I know. How did you find the Baron? Well, of course, there was no need at all for me to go to him. I think it was horrid of you to make me waste the time in rushing out there at all. I will go out there now myself. By the way, did Althea say anything to you about your leaving Berlin for a time? About my leaving? She cried with positively indignant surprise. Directly after my appearance, when everyone will be talking about me? Herr Bastable! Her father will go, and she will go with him. You can scarcely remain by yourself, can you? Are you all mad, or in league to ruin me? Why, to go away at such a moment would be— The tragedy of such a prospect was obviously too terrible to be put in words. But the court will prefer you to be away for a time, I said, rising. Our letter to the Emperor did all that we hoped, and the Imperial Marriage is now definitely settled. The happy pair will be among the guests tonight to witness your triumph. I hope it will be great enough even to satisfy you. She was a singular girl. She showed her lovely teeth in a smile, cast down her eyes, sighed, and then looked up and held out her hand. I didn't understand you at first. Of course you mean that I should show that I really do feel the separation keenly. Oh, I wish I had always had someone so clever to advise me. I should not break my heart if I were you, I replied gravely. She flashed a quick glance at me. I shall get over it, but don't you think we might contrive to let it leak out that, if I really must go, it is because I am so upset? We can try, I laughed. You have a knack of putting things so nicely, Herr Bastable, she said as we shook hands. Do that if you can for me. Oh, by the way, there's a letter for you from Althea. I quite forgot it. It was only a line to say that she had gone out to her father and intended to bring him back with her, and she hinted that until we knew more of his feeling toward me, it might be better for me not to see him. Would I wait for her return? I set off to see Basset and get the papers which I had given him overnight, and then hurried on all the preparations for my leaving the city. I went 2 or 3 times to see if Althea had returned, but it was not until quite late in the evening that I saw her. I was sure you would understand my going off to my father, she said when we met. Of course, it is just what I would have had you do. How is he? surprisingly well, just like himself, but I have persuaded him to go to bed. Besides, I thought you would rather tell me all there is to tell alone. I am dying to know it all. I never passed such a day of suspense in my life. It is all just what you would wish it to be, except perhaps in one respect. I'll tell you that presently." And I went on with a long description of everything except the truth about Herr Ziegler's murder. She put many questions and insisted upon having all the details, her tell-tale face showing how intense was her interest. "And now what is there I shall not like?" she asked at length. I looked very grave. "It is about you and—" I paused and appeared reluctant to speak of it. "I tried very hard to arrange so that— You will give me credit for having done my best in your interests, I'm sure, but—" "What is it?" she cried impatiently. I sighed, and then asked hesitatingly. "It was made a sort of condition, you know, and although he was willing to leave everything else to you, I couldn't get any relief." "But what is it?" she cried again. "I scarcely like to—it's so difficult that—but I'm afraid you'll have to give in. You know how hard I tried to save you from from Von Felsen, but—I don't like putting it on the ground that it would help me, but it really would mean that— Would that marriage—" I paused as if in great embarrassment. "Tell me, this is cruel," she said quickly. "Could you make the sacrifice? You said he had left the country. I wasn't speaking of—" She did not let me finish. She laid her hand on my arm and looked up all smiles and blushes into my eyes. "It would serve him right if I refused, sir. To frighten me like this. Does the condition frighten you then?" She crept into my arms and laid her head on my shoulder with a little sigh. There was no need for any other answer. We were nearly caught in this silent enjoyment of our victory by Chalice, who came rustling in to tell us of hers. "It has been an absolute triumph," she announced boisterously. "The Kaiser was so delighted with my voice that he sent for me to say that he should pardon the Baron on my account. He is the loveliest man in the world." And to this hour she believes that it was that, and that only, which had secured the imperial clemency. End of chapter 30, and of An Imperial Marriage by Arthur W. Marchmont.